Okay, hello everybody. I think it's 5:30 and just a little bit beyond 5:30. So appreciate you joining me. Sorry I got the link out a little bit late there. I'll try not to cut that so closely, but I think it's the same link every time for this particular class. I don't know. I tried to do a fix on the computer just now to see whether or not I can hear you. Can somebody say something and see if I can hear you? Oh dear. Okay.
Hello.
I was kind of afraid of that.
Hello.
Okay, I'm going to have to call AV. Let me just do that real quickly. Just give me just a second here. I'm going to call them and have them come over. I tried an experiment that didn't obviously work. I'm going to have them come over. I'll go ahead and continue the class. I just want to have them come over though and take a look at that. So I apologize. I thought I had a fix, but I guess I was wrong. So hold on just a second. Sorry, I had myself muted. Can somebody say something so I can see if the speakers are working?
Hello.
Anything? Just say something.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I don't hear anything from the class. Nope. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. All right. No problem. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, well, it looks like he's on his way up here, so I apologize for doing that now. I just thought I thought I could get it to work from my console there. It turns out I could not. So anyway, he's on his way up here, hopefully to figure that out for us, and so we'll go from there. So anyway, let's go ahead and begin, and we'll start tonight's class session. So a couple things I should note. The week 2 modules up there. In fact, I've got all the modules for where we are in the class up on the Brightspace page, so you should be able to follow along. So last week we started talking about the first 2 chapters, some of the content from those first 2 chapters. As I mentioned that time, we were sort of weaving in and out of some of the content for those, maybe not taking in the exact order in which they're presented, but that's sort of okay because they're sort of preliminary, introductory content that sort of covers the ground for all econ, whether it's an intro, micro, or macro course. And so, and we got the last thing I started last time was the content from the chapter 1 appendix, which is sort of a math piece, and that's sort of where I ended. And that's sort of where I'd like to finish up now. And I think I sort of left it to the class last time that if you feel really strong at math, that maybe you could you want to check out and not necessarily worry about that. Okay, there's our AV guy right there. And so that's sort of where we left off. And I do want to sort of pick back up on that.
So for you to hear audio in the room,
Yeah.
the projector has to be on.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. So somebody turn that off. I think it's
Well, it should be off in between classes, so you just
Oh,
have to
okay.
come in.
okay. So can somebody say something? But how do I get rid
It'll
of
take a second.
How do I get rid of okay.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah, he's gonna adjust the volume here.
Oh, you can see us and hear us. That's pretty cool.
Ah, hey, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can.
And I can hear you. Wow, miracle. So we had to have this thing on. Okay. And I'm assuming the light goes off at some point, so we can turn it on.
No, there's no blank option in this room. So
Oh. Really?
yeah, really. It's just
Now wait a minute. So I can't. So this light has got to. So the screenshot's got to be on the screen, or else I can't hear them. I think that's the way when we did it in Smith Brush from 103. I think we had.
yeah, it just works differently in this room. Every room's a little different.
Oh,
This
no.
room doesn't have a blank function. The best we could do is probably just put like a black. So basically just put the zoom up here, so it's just black.
Yeah, that's not gonna. Oh, geez. I don't know. Let's think about this a minute. Okay, so if I want to get rid of this, then what do I do, just in case this is overly distracting? Just go back to what?
So if you want to be able to hear them, it has to be on.
It has to be on. But if I want to get rid of that, then I would
By that, do you mean?
get rid of that where the name is up there and the.
Oh, you could just.
You know, this isn't going to work. I don't see there's any way this is going to work because this is going to interfere with what I'm doing here, and we're going to have to switch rooms at some point. So, because this just isn't going to work. So,
You can move the camera to a different part of the.
well, they need to be able to see me. That's the problem. So, if we can move this image off, that'd be fine.
No, you can't.
But they need to be able to.
That's where the screen is.
Okay, well, we need to get rid of it. We can't deal with this. So I'll have to change rooms, but I can't do it tonight. So, all right, let's get rid of this. So just turn it off.
Yeah, you won't be able to hear them if you turn it off.
I know.
Okay.
There's no other way around it. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Well, I did the best we could. Apparently, the only way I can hear you is if I have the projector on, but then I've got this light blasting, and you've got the Zoom screen that I see, and I just don't see that that's going to work. So I'm going to have to change rooms. I apologize for that. I had no idea that was even going to be the solution. I thought I had a solution. Actually, I stayed a little late last week to try to figure it out, and I thought I had it figured out, but I guess I was wrong. And so when we started class earlier tonight, I said, somebody say something, that sort of thing. So anyway, I hate to look like a Keystone Cops operation, but unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with it tonight. I'll talk to the business school and see if we can get a different room and go from there. We had a different room last semester. The only reason I'm using this one is because I'm pretty much here all day on Monday and Wednesday. So, anyway, my bad. I apologize for that. If you do want to speak out, just feel free to do so. I apologize for the, just you can use the chat function is what I mean by that. So I'll be more than able to hear you. Also, the PowerPoint slides for I didn't post them to the Brightspace site when I was first preparing the classes I mentioned last week because they were sort of coming through as double vision in Brightspace, and we had a little bit of this trouble last time. I'm going to go ahead and email this to you, but I'll do it after the first break. And then because I'm going to talk just a bit more about the chapter 1 appendix before we get going, as we get going. And then I want to get into just one other model And then I'll get into chapter 3, which will take us into this week's conversation. And but I'll email those PowerPoints to you so you've got those and you can follow along from there. And again, I really apologize for the inability for me to hear you. That does sort of, it's like a one-way kind of deal, but believe me, I can see you. If you put something in the chat box, I will be able to see that. So anyway, we'll try to make do. We'll figure it out for next time. And I also do have the auto transcription on, so if you are looking at that, you can sort of follow along with my mumbling. So anyway, all right. So anybody have any questions about anything we did last time at all in class or online with any of the activities that we did? I know that last week, the only activity we had online was the discussion. And I think most everybody participated. I think maybe not 100% of the class did make your discussion posts. So keep in mind, this is intended to be a hybrid course. So a little bit of in-class activity, which because of you guys started during the COVID epidemic, you have been doing it through Zoom the entire time, which is what we're doing here, but also with some online activities. The online activities were quizzes, exams, and the discussions. So just try to post your initial reply by Thursday. And I realize you've got another class you're taking as well. So I try to push that back as late as possible. And then the quiz itself for this week. So week 2 discussion is the only other discussion activity. And then there's a quiz that will be due on Sunday. So.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
If you do decide to change classrooms, 413, 313 do have video link functions,
Okay.
and I think they're available. So
Okay, so
just along the time.
413 might work. Okay, I'll talk to them and see if they can do that. Okay,
All right, cool.
appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so maybe we're just going to move two doors next door to us. Anyway, so I was talking about the quiz. So the quiz will be available. Quiz is available now. I made it available this morning, so it's available through Sunday night. You can take it as many times as you like, and you're free to do that. And it will cover more or less the material we've been covering up to this point. So if you want to wait till after Monday's class in order to take it, perfectly fine. Not a problem there. So make sure that you post the discussion activity and then post a couple of others just as follow-ups. And it doesn't have to be anything big, but again, as I mentioned last week, just try to avoid probably the biggest shortcoming that I see really with any kind of online activity regarding discussions is a tendency toward the to a conversational and trivial sort of comments. And just if you can keep it, about 3 or 4 sentences dealing with the material at hand, you should be fine. And if you can get those in by Sunday, they'll be good. I will also provide your feedback on the week 1 activity in the next couple of days. So look for that. And it'll be quantitative as well as qualitative. I'll provide notes as well, unless it was perfect and it'll just be great job or something to that effect. So, okay. All right. So if anybody has any questions, feel free again, just to go ahead and post them in the chat box. It looks like we will have a resolution to this problem next time. It does seem like we're still in new realms here with regard to the Attend Anywhere classrooms that we've got. So let's pick it up real briefly from the Chapter 1 appendix where we talked last time. And I think one of the last things that I talked about was this idea of dealing with a first quadrant plane, which is where we're going to be working really with a lot of graphs in this class. And again, I just want to sort of reiterate something that I said last Monday, and that was the idea that this math piece is not intended to just wear you out and exhaust you and cover ground that you may have seen before, but really is to sort of set the outer limit of expectation for what the math utilization is going to be in the course, because I know sometimes there are those who have math anxiety, and I get that. People have anxiety about all kinds of things, and math is sometimes one of them, for some, not for all. And so I just want to sort of assuage you on some of that. So we talked about it last time, where if we had some sort of point A and some sort of point B, where A would have been corresponding to some X1, Y1, and the value itself changed to become some X2, Y2, and some ordered pair kind of concoction. And that they basically corresponded to their excuse me, respective points along the corresponding axes. And as a result of this, in 2 dimensions, we can put them together and draw a straight line which would have the generic formula of y equals mx plus b, okay? And I know you've all seen this before, at least I think you have, where this is basically a functional relationship. Now, not all equations are truly functional in the sense that a function is that one thing causes another thing to happen, particularly when we talk about conditionality and causality, where the x does what it wants to do, like it's got sort of free will, and then y is sort of a scorekeeper that sort of keeps track of all the action on the other side of the field. So this is the scoreboard, this is the action on the field. The b is the y coordinate or the y-intercept if it does cross the y-intercept. And then the most important value is m, which is slope. And I know that we've all seen slope before, but slope is basically a rate of change. It's rate of change in one variable in relation to the other. And when we talk about the rate of change, it's simply we're using the Greek symbol delta y over delta x, which I think is probably somewhat familiar to you, but we will be using the delta symbol periodically throughout the course to represent the change in something. And lest we be totally freaked out about the idea of slopes, all that real or delta symbols and Greek symbols in general, all it really is simply new minus old, and new minus old. That's all it really is. Y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And if we were to plug in values there, we would get some value. So if we were to say y1 is 5 and y2 is 9, x1 is 4, x2 is 12, and I'm just making the numbers up here, then we can compute the slope, and let's just simply do it. Won't take but a second. Y2 minus 1 is 9 minus 5. X2 minus x1 is 12 minus 4, which is 4 over 8, which is 1/2. And in other words, the slope of that particular line is 1/2. What's missing is the positive sign. And so an upward sloping function, upward sloping straight line has a positive slope. And this is really important because it's going to relate to our discussion later tonight about upward sloping functions in economics. When we have upward sloping functions and what they mean, in other words, what they mean is a direct relationship between two variables. So a positive slope basically is this. A positive slope is a direct relationship between x and y. A direct relationship between x and y. And in other words, what it means is if x goes up, y also goes up. And if x goes down, y also goes down. That's what a direct relationship is. And if it were to be negative, let's say we have a straight line with something like this, and we end up with a negative slope, then a negative slope basically means an inverse relationship between x and y. And that is if x, I'm kind of running out of room here a little bit, but let me see here, inverse relationship, and that is if x goes up, y goes down, and if x goes down, y goes up. And I hope you can see that on that board over there, but that's essentially what the inverse relationship is. One thing goes up, the other thing goes down. And we're going to be seeing these kinds of relationships again and again and again and again in macroeconomics, because particularly when we get to talking about policy, and that is what do government policymakers do in order to change something? Like if we want Y to go up, for instance, and what might we do to X? Maybe we want to lower taxes to increase spendable income, which has been done. Keep in mind that during this last downturn, pandemic related, the government did lower taxes by essentially giving these stimulus checks and tax cuts and larger child tax credits, advances on those larger child tax credits, which are simply all forms of fiscal, that is budgetary stimulus, in order to drive up spendable income. And I think it really had a difference. And I think that whatever kind of economic downturn we experienced as a result of the pandemic would have been a lot worse had it not been for those support payments. And I know some people have been critical of them, but saying that maybe it's responsible for the low labor force participation. People don't want to hit the workforce again because of that. I think that's a difficult idea to prove. And I think a lot of people have not come back to the workforce because a lot of people have taken early retirement or simply are just doing other things and sort of maybe dialing down their lifestyle in some respects. The work from home culture, I think, is here to stay for many firms. And I know that a lot of my relatives who live on the East Coast are seeing people just simply leave, particularly like New York City, because why live in New York and pay the exorbitant rents when you can live in wherever, New Jersey or Connecticut, and pay less and still have the same sort of job. So just an example of that. You want one thing to change, make something else happen. Maybe if you want to bring incomes down to sort of rein in inflation, maybe you would raise taxes. And so this inflation piece is particularly interesting because we're going to be seeing policy here. Well, it's either going to be today or Wednesday where we're going to see an increase in interest rates in order to slow the economy down because of the fact we've got inflationary pressures that just are building and building and building with really no particular end in sight. So anyway, this is really all that I wanted to cover with regard to the chapter 1 appendix. There's more material in there, but it's essentially what we're talking about here. So I don't want to spend a great deal of time on it, just simply because, number one, it might be a review. But what I really do want to do, though, is bring this back, though, to where we are going to be using this in economics, particularly today, or in tonight's class session, when we get into talking about functions. And we're going to be seeing that when we talk about things in economics, and we're going to be dealing with this first quadrant, not the second, third, fourth, throughout the course. And so when we deal with this first quadrant, we tend to plot things in economics from a very generic level, either on the vertical axis in terms of dollar figures or percentages on the vertical axis, dollars or percentages, and things that are a numerical number, countable number on this axis, and sometimes dollar figures on this axis as well. So there's no particular rhyme or reason as to why we do that. For whatever particular model, we could take any model, we could invert the axes and get the very same sorts of relationships. There's no reason why we would want to plot anything on one particular axis. It doesn't matter. In fact, we're going to be talking about a particular model. It's a sort of a theoretical model. It'll come later in the course, where various textbooks will have one variable on this axis and the other on that, and others will simply reverse it. So in some cases, you get a curve that goes like this, depending upon what it looks like, or a curve that goes like that, depending on how you graph them. But all I'm simply saying is this is sort of the convention that we use, and it tends to be dollar figures on the vertical axis, but in some instances, we will put dollars on the horizontal, but oftentimes things of a countable nature almost always go on this axis right here. And that's where we're going to jump off as we get into chapter 3. And we'll probably do that right after we take our first break. So anyway, let's where we ended up last time was, I think, talking about this idea of these slopes in general and linear functions. And we've got one more model I want to cover that was talked about in the first 2 chapters, since we talked about because there are really 2 main models that we're covering at this point. We talked about the circular flow model a bit last time. That was the model of actors and the roles that they play in the economy. We had 3 main actors: households, government, and business firms. And we'll be talking about all of them intermittently as we get going throughout the course. And as I mentioned to you last week, that I'll be adding bits and pieces to that as we add some more detail to the course content. We'll add the financial sector, we'll add the rest of the world of imports and exports, and we'll do a lot of other interesting things with it as well. So there are a lot of things that we can do with that model. So that's the first of the true models that we began to work with in this class. And remember, I think I mentioned last time that when we talk about models, and it's a word that economists like to use a lot, pretty much everybody in the sciences that deal with any kind of mathematical representation deal with models. And all they really are, they're graphic representations, they're simulations, they're simply representations. Sometimes they're just sort of a projection of a what if, what might happen. If this happens, then what might be expected to happen. And that's how we model these particular kinds of things. And modeling is used really in a lot of different areas. I know in the football world, football teams like to model out what particular plays might be run, given various scenarios and whatnot. And so that would be an example of modeling at work there, statistical modeling, based on what they think might work. And in economics, we'll be looking at a variety of models, really beginning tonight and going forward throughout the rest of the term. So let's give me a second here. Let me get my stuff together here. So let's talk about the second model that deals with a model of production. And it basically takes a hypothetical economy and decides about what is to be made. Now, remember, in this, as I mentioned last week, that in this first class and a half, what we're really talking about is content that sort of weaves its way in and out of introductory econ, whether it's micro, macro, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. And it answers sort of the who, what, when, where, why. We talked a little bit about the who with regard to the circular flow model, households, firms, and governments. We talked a little bit about the what's, and that is what they're exchanging, goods and labor for money and wages, spending and wages, that sort of thing. We'll talk a little bit about the how here, and in terms of how a society allocates. And so let's do this. Let's build a model again in the first quadrant. And this is going to be simply known as the production possibilities model. And I know this was the reading for last week, so hopefully you've all gone over that and in the book. But if not, that's fine. We will talk about it tonight. And then once we finish this, we'll take our break, and then we will get into some of the content from chapter 3, which deals with demand and supply, where we pick up these issues once again. And there was actually a reason why we went over this idea of models in the first quadrant and slopes, etc. So if we have this first quadrant model, again, think about where the origin is right here. These rays go on forever. When we talk about production possibilities, we're going to make an assumption that, and we're going to simplify our assumption by saying we've got an economy that produces two goods, and it's going to be good A and good B. And right now, let me address at the outset one of the concerns that sometimes comes up when we talk about these very simplified models, and that is, what do you mean an economy that only produces two goods? Even the most primitive of economies in the world will produce more than two goods. Even some of the poorest places in the world have access to resources that can allow them to produce more than two. And that is true, but that's also not really the point. And in fact, if you wanted to model the production of all goods in an economy, you could simply, by using this methodology, you could simply take more and more graphs and simply plot those against one another. You probably would need the use of computers at some point, given the complexity of the interrelationships between all of these. But here's the big thing. The important thing is this, that we are very often faced in economics with this idea of choice and the idea of how and why we are producing goods. And it's very often this issue of a trade-off that exists. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But it's this idea that if we make a choice here, the choice is between doing some of good A and some of good B. And so we are confronted then with what's called the PPF, the production possibilities frontier, which is downward sloping. Excuse me. It's downward sloping. So what does that tell us, given what we know already now about slopes? And that is the idea that if one thing goes up, the other thing must go down. And in fact, that is the case. If one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So if we're producing at a random point along this particular curve, what this is basically telling us is this. We can produce, in our hypothetical economy, a choice of two outputs. We can produce at some A1 and some B1 combination. Okay? And that is the choice. So whatever A1 and B1 are, and these would be the quantities of these goods. These aren't dollar figures. These aren't percentages. These are simply numbers against numbers, okay? Excuse me, I'm trying to get over a cough and it's still kind of hanging on. So we have an inverse relationship between these. And so what does that mean? If we wanted to slide down this curve here, we wanted to produce a little bit more A as a result, then we can do so only by producing less of good B. And so as a result, if we get more of good A, we have to give up some of good B. So giving up some of good B is what we give up in order to produce some of good A. And this giving up of good B is simply what we refer to as an opportunity cost. So an opportunity cost is the value of a foregone option. We can produce A1, B1, but we wanted more A. And so in order for us to produce more A, we've got to give up some of B, and that's the cost excuse me, it's the cost of producing more A is the giving up of some of good B. And why do we give it up? Well, the idea behind this is the sense that we can't do it all, that there's oftentimes we're sort of constricted by what we've got available to us in terms of resources. And so if we produce more of one thing, we've got to give up something else. Just think of this, even if you want to use something as basic as time, right? If I want to spend between 5:30 and 8:20 on Monday night going to class, it must mean I have to give something else up. Whether that's working extra hours, spending time with my family, whatever, that's a cost it's something that's given up in order to get something else. And we have to sort of judge the difference between those two. Does the benefit exceed the cost? Not just the actual dollar cost of producing more A1 as opposed to or more A as opposed to the old A, but rather it's the cost of giving it some of the value of B. Whatever B was going to give us in terms of value, what does that, what are we giving up in order to do that? Sorry about that, that's me. So it's the value of a foregone alternative. And this is important because it comes up again and again and again in economics. And that is the idea, it's the value of a foregone alternative is something that we give up in order to do something else. And this is what really differentiates the entire issue of cost in economics from the issue of cost in accounting and finance, is the idea that we do account for opportunity costs as the value of foregone alternatives, where it's not particularly well accounted for in the accounting world. But in all fairness to the accounting conventions, there's a reason why it's not accounted for. It's because we don't really know what the value of that necessarily is. So for instance, if you're giving up 3 hours of your time on Monday, maybe you have nothing else to do on Monday, and so your opportunity cost is very low. Maybe you give up the opportunity to earn overtime for these 3 hours, and maybe you are giving up something very significant indeed. It's different, it's individual, which is why it cannot be an accounting cost, because if it differs for person A from person B to person C, then it's subjective, and that does not meet the criteria of something that is objective, but it is experienced by the individual actor. In this case, it's an individual actor that we would simply call the entire economy. And by the way, when I teach microeconomics, I'll simply say this model could be a firm, it could be an entire industry, or it could be an entire economy. Since we're talking about macro, I usually discuss the idea that it's an entire economy that's doing the operating here. And that is that you can pick any 2 points along this curve and you can and choose these particular trade-offs. By the way, if you wanted to reverse this and say, okay, then I'm at A2, B2, and then I want the original A. Well, I want the original B. Well, I get the original B by giving up some of the A, and then that becomes my opportunity cost of that new option of going back in the other direction, which is simply the value of that foregone alternative, whatever that foregone alternative is. And I can't recall from this version of the text, I think we're in the 22nd edition of McConnell, and we've been using that text for years and years. And there are oftentimes these little articles that are, well, it's interesting, little articles that sort of personalize econ. And I can't recall whether or not this is the edition they had, I think it was Tiger Woods, who dropped out of Stanford in order to go play golf. And so he gave up the opportunity to finish his degree in order to pursue a golf career. In his case, I would say that probably did pay off, didn't it? Particularly since you can always go back and finish your degree, but you can't always be in shape to be a professional athlete. So that's an example of that. Had he left Stanford in order to, do something, well, become a pro golfer and wasn't any good at it, was a lousy golfer, then maybe the opportunity cost would have been too high. Maybe he should have stayed in school. So you kind of get the idea. It's subjective, it's individual. We know how the Tiger Woods story ended up turning out. Okay, so I want to come back to this particular configuration of the curve here. It's downward sloping, but it's also sort of concave downward. That is what? What does that mean? It means that it becomes more vertical as it approaches the horizontal and more horizontal as it approaches the vertical. In other words, the slope speeds up and flattens out depending upon whether it's going to the horizontal axis or to the vertical axis. In other words, the slope might have been somewhere around 45 here. Remember that the slope of a curve is simply the slope of the line that's tangent to it at any one point. That's not a very good straight line, but so right here, it might be something pretty close to like 45 degrees down or something like that. It's still not a very good tangent line, but I think you kind of get the drift. And then as we get going down here, it gets a little steeper, a little steeper, and a little steeper. And that's because of the fact that the trade-offs become even more pronounced as we get going deeper into this. So if we were pushing ourselves out here, we've got good A, and we've got good B here, and we come back here. Now we're operating very far out, and let's say we're producing good A1 here, and B1 here. So we're pretty far out on this particular axis, and we want just a little bit more A, just a little bit more A. We give up quite a lot of B in order to do that. In other words, what's going on here is as we approach these particular axes, is that we get a little bit of gain of A, but we give up a lot of gain, or we give up a lot of B. And this is basically what we would call the law of increasing opportunity cost. Increasing opportunity cost. And that is, the more that we commit to something, the more that we're all in on something, the bigger the stakes become, because we give up even more of whatever it was we were also doing in order to pursue this particular thing. It's the law of increasing opportunity cost basically says that the more we push in this direction, so the width of this corridor here, which is very narrow, represents the gain in value of A, but then the loss of value of B is much fatter, and that's the fact that it's not equivalent. Where here, these widths of these corridors between A1, A2, B1, B2 are relatively the same, and so it's considered to be a relatively fair trade-off. But as we push closer to these axes, as we get more vertical as it approaches the horizontal, more horizontal as it approaches the vertical, these changes in slopes mean something, and they mean something in terms of an increased or enhanced opportunity cost. And this is what's really important about this particular idea here. Okay. Also, a couple other things about this curve itself. And if you have questions, feel free to just punch them into the chat box there. It's perfectly fine to do. One other thing that we should talk about is this, or a couple other things. And I apologize, we've only got one board to work with here. It's just sort of our lot in life with the Zoom sessions, because I would ordinarily use all three boards across the room to make my point here. But if we've got good A, we've got good B, and we've got some sort of production possibilities frontier. Well, let's come back to this notion of what this frontier means. What does it mean? It means that given our present capacity as an economy, as an entire macroeconomy, this is the most that can be produced in terms of these two outputs. It's anywhere on this curve in these combinations. Realizing, of course, that it might not be optimal to be producing way out on these axes because of the giving up of even more value as we commit more of one thing, we give up a lot more of something else in order to pursue that very thing. So it might not be worthwhile to do it, but these are nonetheless combinations of outputs that we can deal with. But here's the thing: what about if we're operating at some point here, somewhere inside the curve, where we've got some A1, B1? Well, here, what's going on is this: we've got a condition that's considered suboptimal. In other words, this is a point which we refer to as productive inefficiency. And productive inefficiency basically says that given our input combinations, remember we talked about inputs last time: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurability were the four broad categories by which we house inputs. Within inputs themselves, we can have things like materials and labor and inventory and energy and power and all these other kinds of things. But we're not using them appropriately. And so as a result, we're getting a stymied economic performance. That in fact, we could be able to push our performance outward in any of these paths, in any of these different combinations if we so wanted. But because we're not, we've got a condition that's called productive inefficiency. In other words, in economics, we have a term for that we simply refer to as unemployment. And when we think about unemployment, I think most of us think of labor unemployment, and that's for obvious reasons. I think that's what when the term unemployment comes up, we tend to think of labor unemployment. Economists will take a little bit more of a broader view of unemployment, and that is, it's not just unemployment of labor resources, but it's all productive resources. And so it's labor that's not being utilized to the best and most appropriate use within the economy, but it's also the fact that capital goods are not being used. And as you've got plants which are sitting idle, or which we're operating 3 shifts a day, are now down to 1 shift. We're firmly ahead of 50 18-wheelers operating at all times, are now only operating 25. So as a result, we've got idle resources, and that's really what productive inefficiency is. And this is why unemployment is considered to be a problem. And we're going to talk much more about unemployment as we get closer to that section in our course. And we'll tend to focus really on the labor aspects of it. But I just want to sort of point out now, because we will be opening the door more to that as we get deeper into the class, that unemployment in our context refers to unemployment of all resources, all inputs, factors, not just the labor piece. So what's the goal here? Well, the goal is to operate at full employment, which all these points are, right? Full employment, full employment. They're just different combinations. They may or may not be the best combinations, but those are all full employment operating pieces. And so as a result, if we can somehow give this a boost, give this a shove, give it a push, get out and push, we can get to full employment somehow based upon any of these particular expansion paths. And what's the solution to that? Well, we're going to talk about a number of potential solutions to unemployment and what to do about it. And we'll also get toward the very end of the class, week 6, week 7, something like that. We'll be talking about what some of the theoretical divisions are within macroeconomic thinking, some of which, believe it or not, don't really view unemployment as that serious of a problem. Instead, are much more fixated on inflation as a problem. And that view may be sort of gaining in prominence at this particular time, given our inflationary tendencies. But as to do about unemployment, we'll talk about different views that suggest that maybe unemployment can be fixed through government involvement in the economy. And that's, I think, a pretty conventional view that government can have a role to play and does have a role to play. Okay. All right, so questions about any of this. This is why this is called a frontier, is because at the present time, given our present labor force and our present input mix and the state of our technology and our tax rates and our trading relationships, this is where we're sort of hemmed in. This is sometimes called a constraint, and it's like any constraint, it's like a seatbelt. It sort of restricts the growth outward. So as a result, any kind of pushing along this represents a full employment situation. So the question then becomes really this: what about if we wanted more A and more B? Is that possible? Because what we've been given here is that of a trade-off. A trade-off exists. If I want more A, I've got to give up some good B. So what if I want more of A and more of B? So we've got good A here, good B here, and I want more of both. Well, the only way to get there, really, where we can take the situation, and let's just pick a random spot here. We'll call this A1, B1. The only way to get there is to push this whole curve outward. And by pushing outward, we now have a situation where we can, in fact, have more of good A. So A1 can go up and B, or A can go up and B can go up. So we can have more of A and more of B because we've got a shift in the entire curve outward. And so this curve outward, this shift represents what? Well, this shift represents what we would simply refer to as economic growth, which is really the opposite of unemployment. And that is that we can employ more resources and have more outputs. So remember, there was a very, very simple sort of Fred Flintstone's Sesame Street model that I put up on the board last week. That inputs out here scattered, and then you had the production process here, and then outputs. Well, these would be outputs. And so if we're able to better utilize inputs and we're able to grow the economy, we can have more of everything. More of A, more of B, because the pie itself is bigger. And I think that is really what the goal of economic policy is at the macro level, is to have economic growth over time that's sustainable and that does not create inflationary conditions. And that last condition there is where some of the trouble has begun lately, because yes, we've got growth, but we also now got inflation, so that's a bit of a problem. Any questions so far about anything I've talked about to this point? Okay, well, if you do, go ahead and type your question. Hopefully by this time next week, we won't have this really sort of constricted atmosphere where I can't hear you. We had a brief time where I could hear you. That was kind of nice, and I assure you, I do want to hear you and all that. And I know when he told me that you have to have the projector on in order to hear people, that was the last thing I expected to hear. I did not think that was going to happen. I just thought it was some sort of switch that would be flipped, something I'd never seen before. And this version of Zoom is an enterprise version, so it's one that I'm a little less familiar with than the Zoom that a lot of us use at home. I know you can log in through any given Zoom app, but there are some switches and some menus that I'm not as familiar with as I maybe ought to be. Okay. All right. One final thing about this before we move on, and that is to talk about this production possibilities frontier and come back to this idea of good A and good B, and then maybe make this a little bit more meaningful from a macro standpoint and from this who, what, when, where, why production of goods, and to see whether or not this is more meaningful to our real lives. Let's say that we don't want to call these good A here, but we can revert back to a model that's used a lot in the social sciences, and that is the model of guns and butter. And I didn't invent these two particular terms here, guns and butter, but I think you may have come across this before, where it's a choice between, do we produce more guns or do we produce more butter? And what we really mean here by this is maybe not guns as guns per se and butter as butter per se, but instead maybe we're talking about capital goods. And remember from last time, we talked about capital goods as being those goods which are used to produce other goods. And that is what the heart of capitalism is about producing these things that allow us to produce more and more and more that we can build on, we can capitalize. So this would be things like new construction and equipment and inventory, and in other words, business assets that we can produce, that we can build up businesses, the supply side of the output market, in order to boost our economy long term. Versus butter, which is not necessarily butter as butter, but rather is consumer goods. And so as a result, when we talk about butter, we're talking about consumer goods. And here the question is, does the economy dedicate its resources to producing more of this versus more of this? Because by producing more of one thing, and let's forget about the economic growth aspects of this just for the second, and talk about the fact that we've got a trade-off going on here of good A and good B. So the idea is here that to produce more of one, we've got to give up some of the other. So in this particular case, if we are producing some G1 of guns, we want more guns. These are wrong. There we go. Then we've got to give up some butter. Okay, so that's the trade-off there. In other words, if we want more capital goods production, we've got to give up some consumer goods production. And again, we can reverse it in the same way as we did before. If we want more consumer goods, we've got to give up some capital goods. In other words, you can even boil this down to a future version of what we should be investing in the future or investing in now. In fact, the word investing is all full of the idea of the future, right? Why invest in anything if it's not future oriented? Whereas consumer goods are very definitely about the here and now. And so the question is, do we spend on the future or do we spend on the? And that is sometimes a very big question that really has no good answer, because it really depends on a nation's priorities as to what that nation decides to spend money on. And by the way, this idea, and I know that just reverting, and this will be my last point here, but if we revert back to this notion that we talked about early on in this discussion of the production possibilities model, where I said, well, one criticism is that, hey, you've got an economy that only produces two goods. Are you kidding? Well, all right, what about this? What about a situation in which a society is faced with two choices from a macro perspective, and they've got to make a choice as to what to do. And sometimes if you do more of one, you've got to give up something of the other because something has to give. And maybe it's not one thing, maybe it's several things together, but it's the equivalent value necessarily. So if the government's going to spend $200 million on some project, it has to give up less of $200 million on some other project, potentially if we're operating at full capacity. So the question is, what do we spend money on? And I know that during the Iraq War, beginning of 2003, there were a lot of people saying, look, we're spending money on this military involvement in Iraq, where we could be spending the money here at home. And I know I saw an interview with the mayor of Philadelphia at the time who said that, and I don't know if his numbers were right at all. If they're wrong, it doesn't really make any difference. It's the idea of what he was really discussing. And he made the comment that one day's spending on the Iraq War could completely rebuild public housing in the city of Philadelphia. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but you get the idea, though, that at least that idea is out there, that because we're doing this, we can't do that. And I am old enough to remember the moon programs. I was pretty small. I was young at the time. And I remember a lot of people talking, why are we going to the moon when we've got all these problems here at home? And we heard that again and again and again. And frankly, a lot of people agreed with that idea. Some people did not. And it really depended upon your point of view. But you can't deny the fact that a lot of people were saying, why are we doing this when we've got these other issues? And one of the reasons, we had actually planned to go to the moon in the United States, I think another 3 times. And eventually the government pulled the plug because it was starting to kind of bore people, and it wasn't really that fun anymore. And then in fact, there were other things to spend money on and devote resources on. So the public sort of lost interest in that. So that's an example. But there are all kinds. So without getting into all the controversy that involves the politics of it, because certainly something like war is very emotional and whatnot. And I'm not here to debate the wisdom or lack of wisdom of the Iraq War, but it's just the idea that these are choices that are made where members of the public believe there could be other priorities. Rather than doing G, we could do more B, but we can't do more B because we're stuck with that. And by the way, one thing that comes up again and again is concerning healthcare, which is very definitely a consumer good. And almost alone among the industrial world, the United States basically puts our citizens in a situation where we've essentially got to sort of fend for ourselves when it comes to buying healthcare. We don't have a nationalized healthcare program where everyone is guaranteed access. I know the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act of 2010, sought to basically make it easier for everyone to buy health insurance, but the system isn't much changed. It's still private insurance companies and all of that, and it did sort of help people to become insured. But some of the criticisms of healthcare that have been levied throughout the years has been the idea, because we've got such gigantic expenditure on military, that we cannot simply afford a Medicare for all, like Britain, Canada, France, and Germany, all these other countries who have much less military expenditure. And again, it depends upon your point of view. Some would argue vehemently, we need to have that military expenditure. No one else is going to do it, right? That's the argument. And the other argument is, well, maybe we could share those costs a little bit more among others and dial down our expenditure. So there's no easy answer. There's no right answer. And by the way, we're going to be presenting you throughout the class with discussion questions where maybe there's really no right answer at all, because it's simply subjective and it depends upon people's point of view. And that's really the point, because a lot of times in economics, particularly in macro, there aren't easy answers that are just staring us in the face. And we've got to make choices. And very often, because macro policy involves government policymakers, it's the political impetus that sort of forms these choices that are made. So, okay. All right. So anyway, that does it for the production possibilities model and what's going on there. One final thing I'll talk about. We talked about productive inefficiency. One final thing here is another form of inefficiency called allocative inefficiency. Your book talked about that, and allocative inefficiency is when we get to this point where we're producing too much of something and as a result, too little of something else. That would be the example of allocative inefficiency. It'd be like an economy that didn't produce fruits and vegetables. All they made as food were Doritos and pretzels and chips and stuff like that. That would be an example of allocative inefficiency, that we're not producing the right kinds of goods. the goods that society demands. And by the way, this sort of dovetails in a little bit with your discussion from week one, where we talked about command economies. And I think it was good to see a number of you picked true command economies and sort of were able to contrast those against more free market economies, because one of the things about command economies is you've got some centralized planning by the part of some government bureaucrats somewhere who say this is what we're going to produce, where it could be wildly out of sync with what the demand for that particular good is within the economy. And this is when you have overproduction or underproduction of things, like in the old Soviet Union, where there'd be shortages of toothpaste that would last for weeks and weeks, or other sorts of basics, because there was a focus on producing more of something else. And that's why the market system tends to work better. And I don't think there's a lot of data about this now. I think I mentioned in the class last week that maybe 30-some years ago, when as the dying embers of communism were starting to twinkle away, there was some data about whether or not that system could be revived. But I think it's probably not possible at this point. So, all right. So, any questions for me? I think I have the sun in my eyes here, so I'm trying to see you. And I've got these rooms are supposed to have like sunglass shades. These are the new rooms in Excel, but they're not doing a very good job of shielding me from the sun. So I guess we didn't have this problem last week with daylight savings time. So, all right. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to go on to chapter 3. I know you don't have the PowerPoints on this yet. I will send these to you over at the break here. I was trying to scramble around before class and to try to figure out what to do about the sound and whatnot. So, which is why I got the link out a little bit later than what I thought. So I do apologize for that. I will try to get things a little bit squared away next time in terms of sound and whatnot. If we're a couple doors down, that might be helpful. And hopefully that's not an issue, but it should be the same link every time. So I just set it for the end of April or whatever. So, okay, so let's talk about, so now we've gone over these first 2 chapters, not every topic and not in every order as to how it's presented in the text, but these are sort of the who, what, when, where, why in economics that sort of lay out for you some of the basics of economics, whether it's micro, macro, whatever, some of the foundational materials. There's really only one more topic to go over, and it really is that contained in chapter 3. And I didn't assign a chapter 3 appendix to this particular reading, but you can certainly read it if you like. I think there's still an appendix to chapter 3. Even though we just adopted this 22nd edition last fall, or the fall semester, so it's a brand new edition, and but it seems to be very similar to what we have seen before. But chapter 3 deals with supply and demand, and it's an important concept that we should talk about in economics. It's fundamental. We've all heard our whole lives demand, supply and demand, usually in that order: supply and demand. And where if somebody asks a question like, "Hey, why are these concert tickets the way they are?" and somebody will give you the answer, "Well, hey, it's supply and demand," and that's usually a pretty satisfactory answer. And I think it's one that suffices to explain why particular concert ticket prices are what they are. That demand is very, very high, maybe supply is restricted. And so as a result, the price for those tickets is quite high. What was the example that I gave before, that if the Rolling Stones were playing at the pit right down the street from here, and one show only, I would expect tickets to be very, very high for that. Now, if the Rolling Stones played every single day for 6 months at the pit, which they're not going to do, but if they did, I would expect prices to come down because that good would not necessarily be as scarce. Scarcity, again, we come back to that topic that we talked about in week 1. Scarcity is important. If we can go see the Rolling Stones every day for 6 months, then the novelty will have worn off. And I would dare say tickets will go begging in 6 months' time, I would imagine. That's obviously a fairly ludicrous example, but you kind of get the idea that if something is scarce, that the price of that something goes up. But the answer to the question, hey, it's demand and supply, is a pretty good answer. So let's take this from the standpoint of demand first, and then we'll take supply, okay? So let's talk about what demand is. I know you've got a PowerPoint package, which I haven't sent out, but I will. Demand is simply defined as the ability and willingness of potential buyers to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. So it's ability and willingness both. So we talk about demand. We really got this twofold concept here. We've got ability and willingness, and I want this to I want everybody to sort of focus on this ability and willingness of buyers to demand goods at various prices and quantities. They've got to both be there in order for it truly to be considered demand, because you can have the ability to purchase a good, that is the wherewithal, the financial ability, the wealth, or the income, or whatever, to purchase a good. But if you don't have the willingness to buy the good, then that really doesn't make you on the demand side of the good, does it? So if you're a non-smoker like me, I got the ability to buy cigarettes, and I'm old enough to buy cigarettes, and I know where they're sold and all that, but I don't have the willingness. And so I'm not on the demand side of cigarettes. And so whatever goes on with the market for cigarettes, it doesn't impact me. I could really care less. Whether the price doubles, triples, whether it's cut in half, doesn't make any difference. On the other hand, what if I have not the ability, but I have the willingness? Like if, say you have the willingness to drive a Lamborghini, but don't have the ability. Well, that also does not make somebody on the demand side for that particular good, which is one reason why we don't advertise for Lamborghinis in like the Daily Lobo, the UNM paper, student newspaper, or even the Albuquerque Journal. That the general audience would not be, the particular target market. You might see it in something like Fortune magazine or Forbes magazines that investors and little wealthier people might tend to buy. So you've got to have the ability and the willingness for you to be on the demand side of a market. It's the buy side of a market. And by the way, it's both the market for inputs and the market for outputs. And we're going to, this distinction between inputs and outputs is one that's important. It comes up again and again and again in our discussion of economics. And so this leads us then to something called the law of demand. The law of demand. And what the law of demand basically is this, is that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demand. So an inverse relationship exists between price and quantity demand. So price we'll simply refer to as letter P, and the quantity demanded is going to be the letter Q. But we're going to differentiate quantity not just as Q here, but as Q sub D, to differentiate quantity demanded from quantity supplied, because the two are different. So we want to focus on quantity demanded here as distinct from quantity supplied. So there's an inverse relationship that exists between price and quantity demanded. In other words, what it means is this: the law of demand can be codified as this: if the price of the good is going up, the quantity demand of that good is going down. This is not something that's terribly foreign to any of us. If the price of the good goes up, we'll demand less of that quantity. And if the price of the good goes down, we'll demand more of that good. So as a result, that is the law of demand in a nutshell. It's this inverse relationship between these two particular variables, that both of which we can model on a first quadrant plane, and which we will here in just a second. So that's what the law of demand is. And if you've ever had an econ class before, you probably, no doubt, have come across demand and the law of demand and what it is all about. And so that's what demand is. It's the buy side of the market, and we're linking the dollars with the quantity here. So price obviously is a dollar figure, quantity is a number, and so when we put these together here, we come back to this notion on this first quadrant plane where we have price, which is a dollar figure, and quantity, which is a number. And so this is sometimes called the PQ plane. The PQ plane, which is a first quadrant plane. It's also simply known as a basic market model. And right now, we're only going to be talking about demand. We're only going to be talking about demand here. We'll bring supply into the picture after the break, and then you'll have all the slides and all that. We'll be able to put it all together from there. So this is the basic market model. This PQ plane is used all the time in economics to mirror all kinds of things. The market for outputs, the market for inputs. And when we say inputs, remember things like labor can be modeled where we can put the price of labor, which is the wage, and Q, the quantity of labor. If I work more hours, I earn more wages, that sort of thing. So you kind of get the idea. Or if the wage is very high, I want to demand less if I'm demanding labor, which is the firm, right, demanding labor, I want to demand less labor as a result of that. So this leads us then to the sort of the graphical relationship between P and Q in this particular model. Now, by the way, when we talk about a demand curve, where does it come from, and how does it arrive, and is it just theoretical? Is it just a bunch of white-haired college professors who think, hey, this must be what demand must look like because it doesn't make any sense to look any other way, and so as a result, boom, this is what it must look like? Not really, because in a lot of markets there is a lot of empirical analysis. There's a lot of actual objective research is done to determine what the various combinations are of price and quantity. And lots of tests are done, lots of research and surveys are done in order to see what people will do with different prices and quantities. One of the reasons why firms will send out coupons in the mail is because they're trying to see what happens if you lower the price of, it's usually name branded good like palm olive or Clorox bleach or something, where if you lower by 25 cents or 20 cents, how much does that stimulate quantity demanded? If you give them a coupon, how much is it going to respond? So that they can figure out what the demand curve for the good looks like in all of the markets in which they do business. Because this is really a micro model. And then we're going to take the basics of this model, really beginning in chapter 6, we're going to sort of blow it all up to, by blow it up, I mean expand it to include the entire macro economy. But that's one of the reasons why firms will send out coupons, is to try as just one among several techniques to determine what the heck the demand curve looks like. And that they'll arrive at some data points and observations and samples and surveys. You might have some outlying guys like that. But in the end, you'll end up with something like this, like a scatter plot diagram. And through a statistical smoothing technique, you can simply draw a curve through that and end up with a downward sloping demand curve we'll simply label as D. And it's downward sloping, which means what? If the price of a good goes up, the quantity goes down. The price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. And we can see this by taking any kind of example here where we have some point that lies along the demand curve that is associated with its coordinates of P1, Q1. And if the price goes down, what would we expect to happen to quantity demanded? Well, if the price goes from P1 to P2, in other words, there's a price decrease, we would expect the demand side to demand more quantity. So as a result, Q2 will go up. So one thing goes down, the other thing goes up. It could also work in the other direction. You can simply reverse these and say, what if we went from here to here? That is, the price goes up, and the quantity demanded will go down, and that would be the same relationship essentially. It's the same inverse relationship between two variables. They are negatively correlated in that particular way. Okay. And so that negative correlation is really fundamental to our understanding of what demand is all about, because it really sort of points out to us, and it will point out to us even more closely as we get into talking about supply, and that is this notion of the sort of the battlefield that is the model itself, and that has to, and the fight is over price. And by fight, I don't mean it's got to be some sort of violent struggle or anything like that. I just simply mean that there's a conflict that's inherent in this contest between the demand side and the supply side. That is, the demand side wants lower prices, while the supply side, not surprisingly, wants higher prices. And so we will see how this whole struggle works itself out. So this is the demand curve, and that is essentially the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Now, what has happened here is this. In this particular example, what do we have? We have a price change, right? So in other words, we have a movement along the demand curve like that, right? A movement along the demand curve. And so what we can say is this, and it sounds like we are being overly picky here, but a movement along the demand curve is due to a change in price only, okay? And is due to a change in price only. Okay, delta P, which is a change in price. Because so sometimes we will say, in fact, economists themselves are even themselves guilty of this by saying if the price changes, the demand changes. Price goes down, demand goes up. Well, it's not demand itself, it's quantity demanded. A movement along the demand curve is due to a change in price only. And so all that's changed is the quantity itself that has changed. So think about this. When we talk about a demand curve, what we're really saying is that for the time being, this is the functional relationship between price and quantity demanded. It's the functional relationship, which is inverse. And that is that when we say there's a functional relationship, we mean that there is, in fact, by various means that we call econometrics, that we can arrive at an actual equation for demand. But it's a snapshot in time. So we click, take a picture, because demand won't be the same a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever. This is the current state of demand as it is right now. Given what? Well, given all these things which go into determining what demand is, and we're going to get to that here when we come back from break, but it's going to be all those things that go into it are going to mean that demand is what it is right now. The only thing that's happened here is a change in the price. Now, why did the price go from P1 to P2? Well, a lot of reasons. It could be simply that the demand side has chosen, or the supply side has chosen to lower the price. Or it could be something on the supply side that's happening that's making this whole thing happen. That could be one thing. Or it could be government involvement somehow at setting a price control. That is, the government's lowering the price because political pressure on it to lower prices of a particular good, like rent-controlled housing or like health insurance or whatever. You get the idea. So it could be all kinds of forces. It doesn't really make any difference. We know that a movement along the demand curve is due to only a change in price. And it's not going to move the entire demand function itself. Demand is what demand is going to be. But it's a short-term condition. So the thing for us to know is the fact that we can step back, click, take a picture of it, and that will be what demand looks like at a particular point in time. Okay, because it will change. And it will change somewhat dramatically. And by the way, if you want just an example about what a demand curve might look like, it might look something like this, where our demand function, it might be something like this, that P equals negative, maybe negative 2q plus negative 2q plus 5 or plus 10 or whatever, something like that. In other words, it's got a negative slope on this particular function, right? And then maybe 10 is the intercept point, the vertical intercept on here, right? So now it's easier when we deal with straight lines to make this, because this is a linear equation, obviously. And in reality, these are more curvy in real life, but a lot of times textbooks and even those of us who teach this will sometimes represent these as straight lines. It's a little easier to see. Certainly the math is easier to deal with when we deal with that. So that might be an example of a demand function. But the key thing here is, in other words, it's a functional relationship between P and Q, right? It's a functional relationship between P and Q. By the way, you could isolate Q and simply have Q in terms of P or P in terms of Q. It doesn't make any difference. And by the way, you're still going to have that negative sign, which is the negative slope of this particular curve. And so that's really going to represent that particular configuration. And without getting into the idea of, we can have different slopes that look, some are steeper, some are flatter. If you go on to take micro, or if you've already had micro, that is discussed in that particular class. That's not really what we're going to be getting into here in terms of flatter versus steeper. Just the idea that this is a negatively sloped curve, and as a result, it represents the inverse relationship between price and quantity demand. And we want to make clear it's quantity demanded, not quantity supply. Okay. All right. So let's see here. So we've been in class an hour and 15 minutes, and I think is it time for a break? I think it's yes. Does that sound good? Why don't we take a break until about maybe 5 till or 2 till, something like that. Let's take a short break. I will go ahead and email you the PowerPoint slides for this particular discussion so you can follow along. We've only covered really one slide, so we haven't gotten that deeply into it. So let's take a short break, and when we come back, we will pick up and finish the rest of chapter 3. I don't know if we'll get into chapter 6 to 9 at all. It's a fairly important chapter. If we get to it, great. If not, it's not going to be the end of the world, because you know, keep in mind that we've got more time allotted for class time with these Zoom sessions that we did in the regular in-class sessions, because we used to have exams in class, and that accounted itself for, you know, maybe a whole class session there. So we're not any kind of under the gun at all as far as that goes. So are there questions for me about anything? And I know we have to restrict you to the chat box. But feel free to do that if you like. Otherwise, let's take a break and I'll see you in a few minutes, okay? All right. Okay, I think we're mostly back, and if not, I know I'm sort of conversing here on the chat box, and so we can keep that going if you like. But I wanted to go ahead and restart. If everyone's not back yet, it's not a problem. We're not going to go too far deeply into it. Now, the question in the chat box was about accessing the quiz. And if you go to the week 2 learning module in Brightspace, go to coursework up at the top, content, and then there'll be week 2, 314, 320, and there'll be the overview and objectives as to what we're going to be covering this week. And then there's a weekly checklist you can sort of print off or keep whatever you like. And then below that, there's a quiz, and so you should be able to see that. So that's available. And again, it's set so you can take it again and again and again. Let me know also, maybe I should have mentioned this at the outset, but Brightspace is we've had it now for, I guess, about a year or so, I think maybe a year, and maybe a little longer. There have been some glitches that some instructors have had. I know I've had some that I've come across, and sometimes they just kind of throw me for a loop, things I never expected. Last semester, not even this semester yet, because we're already halfway through, or more than halfway through with the regular classes. But last semester we had a deal where quizzes were showing up like 2 or 3 times, and we don't know where they came from. They were just sort of appearing, and we think they were fragments of older classes that have been copied into it out of the old Blackboard system. But who knows? So if you have something weird or goofy like that on the quiz, if you see more than one quiz or exam, let me know. Get with me, and before you take it, hopefully, so that we can sort of make sure that you're doing the right thing. And I'll see. I do try to go in and look at what's called student view, where I can see what your view is. It's not exactly the same as what you see, but it does kind of allow me to see what's going on. So hopefully I can detect that if it does come up again. So anyway, so again, next week we should have the sound issues worked out. We had about a 1-minute reprieve where I could hear you guys, and I feel bad about that, and I apologize. It does make it less fun, I think, for all of us when we can't have a back and forth. And you could have bowled me over when you told me that you had to have that light on. That defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to do. So anyway, so we'll pick it up from here. So we're talking about chapter 3. I went ahead and emailed everybody the PowerPoint package over the break, so you've got that. I was making some last minute changes to it a little bit earlier, but you've got that now. I'll try to get that to you going forward here a little bit earlier, so you can have that available. But we only went through the first slide dealing with demand, and so we really haven't gotten too deeply into it, because I knew that we had still some business from last time to talk about. Okay. All right. Any questions for me about anything so far in today's session? If you do, let me know. And by the way, I know that even though we're sort of constricted from my being able to hear you in class, feel free to get with me whenever you like. Just email me or call me, come by, whatever you prefer, and I'm more than happy. I'm pretty much available as much as you need me for the most part. Weekends I'm a little less available, but I'm still around, and so I should be able to get to you. Mondays are increasingly a kind of a busy day, and so I usually don't get to email until a bit later. But I will respond to you and as soon as I possibly can, and get any questions resolved. So okay, all right. So we talked about this issue of the movement along the demand curve, sliding up or sliding down, depending upon a price change, and what could cause a price change. It's probably something going on the other side of the market, on the supply side, perhaps. Perhaps supply is moving, and so as a result, the price is going down, which means the demand side is going to respond by demanding more quantity. Demand is not changing, but the actual demand function is a picture, it's a snapshot, it's whatever it is. I just gave an example of what a particular function might look like. By the way, you're not going to be having to work with these functions on the quizzes or exams. This is just really just for your edification, just so you can kind of see that these are actual equations that economists can put together to depict what a demand curve might look like. That's just one example. And sometimes they're Q in terms of P, sometimes P in terms of Q. It doesn't make any difference. It's how you want it, whatever variable you want to isolate is however you want to do that. Okay. And by the way, one of the things that economists probably did wrong when they were constructing the PQ plan in the first place was they probably should have put Q on this axis and P on this axis, because particularly given this nature of independent versus dependent variable, it does seem like price is more of an independent variable, and the quantity sort of does whatever price sort of forces it to do. So, so we probably got this backwards, because mostly the dependent variable is usually on the vertical axis in mathematics, independent variable on the horizontal axis. So it probably should have been done differently, but it wasn't. So that's why I say it's really sort of arbitrary whether or not we put P and Q on these on either axis, but we do it as a convention. So this is the way you will see it throughout almost every textbook. So, okay, so we talked about this idea of demand being locked into whatever it is. This is the relationship between P and Q, whatever this functional relationship is at the moment, at a given point in time. And when I say take a picture of it, I don't mean that it's going to change in the next 5 minutes necessarily, although there are markets that do move extremely quickly, like commodities markets and currency markets, where those demand equations become very fluid indeed, but they will change over time. Some markets are much slower moving, and so as a result, you can sort of count on demand, looking at what demand is for some extended period, but something will happen to knock it out of its equilibrium. So in other words, what will happen is this: the entire function will change. So where once economists found that the observations with some outlying variables look like this, now they find the data are sort of progressing in this direction. So now demand doesn't look like D0, it looks like D1. In other words, there's a shift in the demand function, and that is in this case, it's a rightward shift, okay? So what this basically means is this. First of all, let's talk about what a shift is. A shift is basically a change in the equation. It's a change in the equation itself. Meaning what? Meaning that something has gone on, and in this case, it's a rightward shift, meaning that it's an increase based upon based upon the origin, really. So if you took some P here, something called P, you get some Q. What basically means with the rightward shift is that you've got more Q demanded at every price. So this is a rightward shift. A rightward shift in demand is an increase in overall demand. Not an increase in quantity demanded. The quantity will change, but the quantity will change because demand itself is changing. Boom, there's a new click, a new snapshot. A rightward shift in demand is an increase in overall demand. In other words, the entire function is changing. Whatever the relationship is, it's now changing. So we now have something different. We're now, maybe it's the same slope, so we have the same basic formula, but now it's got a higher intercept because it's now shifted to the right. So now the intercept was 10, now maybe it's 15. This may not be drawn exactly the scale, doesn't make any difference, but you kind of get the idea. So a rightward shift. So when we talk about a shift, we're talking about the equation changing. The relationship between these variables is changing, and we're going to talk about what those changes are here in just a second. We call them non-price variables. And more specifically known as determinants of demand. So what's going on with the rightward shift is an increase in overall demand, and that is more QD at every P. And the thing to know about this is this, that I like everybody to think about a rightward shift as opposed to an up as an increase. Yes, it's an increase, but it looks like it's going up, and that's good, but it'll be misleading, it'll be different if you think about up down, particularly when we get to the supply curve. It's going to be, because it's a different slope, it's going to look a little bit differently. Instead, orient yourself to this thing here, the origin, and just think back to the number line, like what we had back all the way back to grade school. Anything to the right is an increase, anything to the left is a decrease. Even a negative value would be a decrease from something, anything to the right of it. So we talk about a shift, we need to talk about right, left versus up, down. It's going to solve you a lot of problems it's going to solve a lot of problems if you avoid that one misstep of thinking up, down, that it's upshift. It is an upshift, but it's a rightward shift. It's away from the origin. So anything away from the origin is an increase in this particular plane. And this is the only quadrant we're going to be using in the Cartesian coordinates. So something has happened to cause it. We'll talk about what those somethings might be in a second. Likewise, you can have a case in which the data is moving the other direction, and now you've got a leftward shift. And so now D0 goes to some D1. Actually, we'll call this D2 now. We'll call that D2 because maybe now the equation is something different. So now we've got a leftward shift. And at the same P, then you've got a lesser amount of quantity demanded. So a leftward, so this is just the opposite. Everything we said about a rightward shift is going to be the opposite. A leftward shift in demand is a decrease in overall demand. Not quantity demanded. Quantity demanded will change because the demand itself is changing, but it's a decrease in overall demand. It's the entire function is changing, and there is less quantity demanded at every P or price. Oops, less quantity demanded at every price. And so now maybe the demand function is something like this, P equals, and we'll say it's the same slope, minus 2Q plus 5, for instance. Okay? Something like that. Whereas the original intercept was 10, now it's 5. And so, in other words, it's shifting to the left. We've got a lower intercept point. Same slope, because they look like they're parallel. So parallel will be the same slope. And we're going to draw these as straight lines. Even though in reality, what we're seeing with demand and supply curves, the reason we call them curves is they tend to be, in real life, they tend to be more curvy than straight line, because really in nature, really throughout the world, things tend to have more of a curvilinear nature than a linear nature. And that's just sort of the way nature is the idea of curves. But we'll sort of simplify it. Shorthand mathematically is to use a straight line. It's easier to work with. The math is easier. And by the way, if you ever go on to take any higher level macro, at the end of this class, you'll say fat chance of that. But if you do, if you get into the curves, you'd have to use calculus in order to do some of these things. And calculus is definitely off the table in terms of what we're doing in this class. Okay. So at the same P, we get less quantity demanded at every price. And that's essentially what a leftward shift is. It's a decrease in overall demand, meaning something has changed that now the demand side doesn't want as much. So think about this, and it's a leftwards moving toward the origin, so it's a decrease. And again, don't think left, right, don't think up, down, think left, right. That is back toward the origin. That's the correct way of thinking about it. So now this begs the question, what can cause shifts in demand? And then the next slide in this package that I just emailed you is, it's number 2, where it says changes or shifts in demand. And we're not talking about changes in quantity demanded, because it's important to know, and I know that your textbook makes this distinction, and there are all kinds of videos on the internet that students have come across over the years, Khan Academy and some others, who just to sort of supplement your understanding, people have looked at these, and they're fine, they're all good. I've seen very few bad econ videos online, but they'll make a very, very firm distinction about movements along the demand curve versus shifts in demand. A movement along the demand curve is only due to a change in price, whereas a shift is due to something else. And furthermore, it's a non-price variable, because nothing here involves the price of the good. The price is whatever the price is, but it's not, and maybe the price will change if something's going on the other side of the market, but it's not the price that's changing, it's causing the shift. It's not what's causing the change in the algebraic relationship between P and Q. It's something that we call non-price variables, i.e. the determinants of demand, which, if you like, could be thought of as sort of the DNA of demand. This is the chemical structure of demand. So what could change that could cause these changes in this chemical formula here? And they might be something like this. It could be a change in income, for instance, something called the income effect. So in this particular case here, we've got a good, and maybe incomes are rising, and so people demand more of these goods. By the way, we call those goods normal goods, right? Normal goods are those goods that we demand more of if our incomes are rising, and we demand less of if our incomes are falling. And this is from a macro perspective. And there's a reason why they're called normal goods. Most goods are normal goods, and so-called because they behave that same way. They're responsive to changes in income. All luxury goods are considered normal goods. That is, people buy more luxury goods as incomes are rising, simply because they've got the wherewithal to do it. And they buy fewer normal goods, including luxuries, when incomes are falling, simply because of the fact that they've got fewer options and they're more constrained based upon their incomes. So the income effect is a big one. And even though this PQ graph is a micro model, where it could be the graph of a model of whatever, the market for shoes in Albuquerque, It doesn't make any difference. It's still these same factors are going to apply, whether or not. And one of the beautiful things about it is you can take a market and either zoom in or zoom out, depending upon what view you want to look at. So you can take the demand for shoes in the United States and construction demand, or maybe it's demand for basketball shoes in the United States. And then you want to focus on even tighter and say demand for basketball shoes in the southwestern United States. And then get even further in the city of Albuquerque and then northwest Albuquerque. You can go, so you can either zoom in or zoom out. It's like a Chinese doll or Russian doll, right? You've seen Russian dolls where you open up the big thing and there's another smaller doll. Open that, there's a smaller doll. It's the same thing. It's an endless series of drilling down into markets. And in macro, we just tend to take the big view. We simply blow it all up and take the big doll, right? And say, this is what the market for basketball shoes is like in the United States, for instance, for any particular good. So the demand is rising, could be because of income. It could be because of income. And a related one is the wealth effect, which it's income and wealth. Now, income and wealth are different. And income is basically, if you were to give a definition of income, it's simply a periodic inflow of resources, usually money. And if it's not money, it's measured in money, right? So it's this periodic inflow of resources. Whereas wealth is more something of what is already settled on and what is already owned. Now, is there a correlation between income and wealth? Yes, there is, but it's not always as hard and fast as what you might imagine, because there are exceptions. By the way, when I was in the banking world, we were advised very strongly to be careful about judging a book by its cover, because if you see somebody coming into your bank that looks like they're penniless, they can in fact be quite wealthy. It's just that this is the way they dress. And in fact, we had a guy who came in. He wasn't one of my customers, but was a customer of our bank and belonged to another branch. But came in to do some business, and he actually looked homeless. In fact, he had a lit cigarette that he had put in his pocket, and there was smoke coming out of his jacket. And I thought, my God, this guy's a mess. It turns out the guy had like $600,000 in his checking account. He was a very wealthy person. He was just a little different, and to say the least, the fact that his jacket was on fire is pretty good evidence of that. But so income and wealth are not necessarily related. He probably had a fairly low income, but had a great amount of wealth. So the two are not necessarily related, but they tend to be. They tend to go in the same direction. But here's the thing about wealth: income is a little bit easier to ascertain and to arrive at. Most people could probably give you a pretty good idea of what their income is. However they know, annually or weekly or whatever, they could probably tell you, even though it's considered to be one of the rudest things to ask somebody, how much do you earn a year? That's extremely rude. I mean, there are all kinds of questions people ask that are nosy, but that is like one of the no-nos, is what is that sort of thing. So, but nonetheless, they could probably tell you what their incomes usually are. And I know that if you're like me, you've probably got a lot of older relatives who will always talk about them being on a fixed income. Well, most people are on a relatively fixed income for the most part. Yes, there are people who work and who maybe like they're entertainers, they're musicians or something, or actors or whatever, whose pay is very sporadic, it's very chunky, or salespeople, things like that. But for the most part, most workers are on a relatively fixed income. So we pretty much know what that is. We know what's going up, we know what's going down. Wealth, on the other hand, is the value of everything that's been accumulated, and that's really difficult to know. It's really difficult. Like, what is the value of my house? Like today, right today? Is it worth more or less than it was a year ago? I mean, we know prices for everything have been rising because of inflation. Does that mean my home is worth more? In fact, I was on some website, I think it was on Zillow or whatever, it actually gave an estimate of the value. Oh no, it was Credit Karma, where it gave a value, the estimate of the value of my house. And it was a lot more than what I paid for it. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good value. Where did they get that number is what I was thinking. I mean, where did that come from? Because it's not for sale. I haven't taken any offers or haven't had it appraised or anything like that. But I was a little bit surprised. And in fact, it may not be right. It may be off by tens of thousands of dollars. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it is. It's really hard to know exactly. And just even if you've got something like liquid assets, like in a pension or 401k, I mean, do you know exactly how much you're worth? And the answer is often you have an idea, but maybe not exactly or even that close. So it's really how you feel about how you are. If you feel wealthier, you tend to be able to want to demand more goods, and you sort of act on that. If you feel less wealthy, you'll demand fewer goods, and so as a result, your actions will reflect the way you feel about things. And it's this whole idea of feeling that is important. And if that sounds a little bit too touchy-feely, well then consider the fact that in economics, one of the big and growing areas is something called behavioral economics, which is sort of the junction between economics and psychology. It's a big growing area. Richard Thaler of the University of Chicago is one of the high priests of that particular thinking, won the Nobel Prize in economics for behavioral thinking. That's the idea of why do people do what they do? It's because, well, they've got feelings and emotions and fears and all of this, and it sort of influences their demand decisions, their labor decisions, their occupational choices, all these kinds of things. Why do we do what we do, right? Isn't that what a lot of what psychology is about in the first place? And I do not claim to be a psychologist, but I do have an interest in that particular area because I do think that it is quite fascinating. So that's another example is the wealth effect. Also, one big one here is changes in tastes and preferences. And I think if we were teaching a micro class, we probably would have that as number one. If I were a marketing person, I probably would definitely have that as number one because it sort of drives a lot of demand decisions. And that is, if a good is becoming popular, everybody rushes into the market to buy that particular good because it's now popular and our preferences have changed. And maybe it could be simply the fact that some good has come along that's replacing something else. It's the next new thing, so everybody's got to have that. So they run out to get that. Likewise, if it's a good that's on the outs, people's preferences are, let's run away from that good. We don't want that anymore. And so as a result, we're dialing down our demand for the good to the point where it hits the axis and goes to zero. There's no demand for that good whatsoever because it's obsolete, it's outdated, it's been replaced. So as a result, that good is no longer in demand. It's because our tastes and preferences change. Also, this could even be, I guess, the fact that we're such a connected world now means that we respond very quickly to news stories. If you see a news story that says that broccoli is killing people in California, then even people who live in New Jersey are going to demand less broccoli because, hey, there's killer broccoli out there. Don't eat broccoli, right? We see this all the time where there's a recall of lettuce or broccoli or tomatoes or something. And so as a result, people stay away like the plague because of a particular taste and preference or fear or whatever that sort of plays into that. Okay, so those would be shifters based upon those particular sort of squishy ideas. The marketing people would not agree that it's that squishy. Also, the prices of related goods. These are substitutes and complements. Now let's define what these are. This is discussed in your text, and I'll just talk briefly about what they are. A substitute good is simply any good which can be swapped for another good for a purchase decision. And they don't even have to be identical goods. You might think of one example that people always bring up is something like Coke and Pepsi, which are basically the same good. I know those are fighting words. Sometimes not everybody agrees Coke and Pepsi are the same, but they're pretty close to being the same. If you're in Walmart and you find the price of Pepsi is radically less for the same quantity than it is for Coke, most people are probably going to buy the cheaper Pepsi, unless you're a real devotee of Coke, and there are those who are. So in which case that's your taste and preference that will decide that. But if it's a substitute that's cheaper, you'll buy that because of that cheaper substitute. But it isn't just these brands though, it's goods that aren't even related to one another. So things like chicken and pork or green beans and corn or tacos and hamburgers. These are not goods that are the same at all, but it depends upon the prices of those goods. If one good is priced lower, relatively speaking, we'll demand more of that good and less of the higher priced good, if we consider it to be a substitute. A complementary good is a good that goes along with it. Some good that goes along with another good because they go together. So the demand for one good is rising, they'll demand more of the other good. So for instance, if the demand for hot dogs is rising, the demand for hot dog buns is also going to rise. Those are complementary goods that go in the same direction. Why on earth would you buy hot dog buns if you're not buying hot dogs, right? It doesn't mean that you can't or nobody ever has, or that it's never been done before, but it's generally the case that you're going to buy hot dog buns to go along with hot dogs. And if people aren't buying hot dogs, maybe there's a scare on hot dogs. hot dogs will kill you, then you're going to buy fewer hot dogs and fewer hot dog buns because your demand is going to shift along those two goods correlate with one another. Goods which go together in the production process, and you can even, or the consumption process, but also even in the production process, that the demand for rubber and the demand for tires goes in the same direction. Rubber being a component of tires, so people buying more tires, they're also demanding more rubber, but that's given the fact that's a derivative of that particular raw material. Okay. All right, so that's another one. Substitutes and complements, those prices of related goods. What are some other? I've got to walk. I'm sorry I have to leave the camera here, but I've got a kind of a space to cover here. Number of buyers in the market. This is something that I sort of talked about, this idea of rushing in versus rushing out. If buyers are coming into a market for whatever reason, then it's going to increase demand for that good. This could, remember, we are talking about markets from a micro perspective for the most part here. If we're talking about the market for shoes in Northwest Albuquerque, and Northwest Albuquerque is growing in population, as it has been, then there are going to be more people demanding shoes, just simply because there are more people doing the demanding. So if an area is growing, then there's going to be demand for more goods, particularly normal goods, that is those goods for which demand responds to income. And over time, incomes do tend to rise because of economic growth. That's really the good news about our economy, is the fact that, yes, we have periodic disruptions where we have downturns in the economy, and sometimes catastrophic downturns, but usually, but the last 90 years, it's been mostly sometimes severe, but not that prolonged downturns in the economy. And then at some point we resume our upward growth, which has been the norm. And so as population grows, income grows, and it forces the demand curve for most goods to the right, which is why we see that business firms tend to grow over time and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. Which is why people like Warren Buffett, the great stock investors, say, just buy great companies because they'll continue to grow over time. And you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to sit in your computer and look at the stock market all day. Just invest in great companies and they will grow over time as the population grows, as income grows. So you got to get that idea. But take the other case in which population is shrinking. It's not just population that is driving number of buyers, but it's one pretty good example and changes in population. So the area where my mom lived, before she eventually went into retirement housing, was really becoming depopulated. People were moving out because it was a very industrialized area, very heavily tied to the automotive business, and so a lot of auto plants and related plants were closing, and so people were leaving, and so demand for a lot of everything was closing. In fact, there was a strip mall not too far from her house in which there was only one store remaining. I think it was a Burger King, and everything else was closed down. I think that and a Hallmark card shop, which to me was completely crazy why anybody would still buy Hallmark cards when they're not buying anything else. But that was it. The whole mall was really shut down simply because of depopulation of that area. It's pretty depressing, but it does happen. Population shifts will do that. But population shifts have been going on since the beginning of humankind. It's going to happen. It's nothing to be, overly depressed about, because it will change. So as population moves, changes and moves around over time. Also, government policy is a big one. We talk about government policy. We're going to be talking much more about government policy and changes in government policy over time, particularly things dealing with taxation and regulation. And one of the things about taxation that we can say is this, that if taxes are rising, it tends to mean a leftward shift in the demand curve. And if taxes are falling, it tends to mean a rightward shift in demand, simply because of the fact that it creates incentive to demand goods, and people have more spending money to spend, and businesses have more net income to devote to demand, because not only is demand just households, but it's also businesses. And by the way, it's also government, as we will talk more about in chapter 6. But if taxes are lower for those in the private sector, because government doesn't tax itself, then it will generally cause demand for most goods to rise. And the same can be said for regulation as well. If regulation is the cost of doing business, then if it costs more to do something, they'll do less of it. So you'll get that idea. So government policy often does frame that. And then one final thing here, which is going to be sort of a lead in to something we'll talk about a bit later in a few weeks, and that is something called expectations. And that is this whole idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's an entire set of theories called the rational expectations theory, which is based upon this idea that rational actors will make decisions based on their own best interest, but furthermore, what they think is going to happen, that they'll try to game the system in order to make the most of their situation. And we'll get more to that, we'll get into the specifics of that later, but for our purposes here in talking about demand, one of the things that might cause a shift in demand to the right is if we feel good about things, our expectations are positive, it will tend to be an increase in demand for most goods, i.e. normal goods, which are most goods, goods which respond in the same way to income and wealth and also to expectations. So if I feel pretty good about my job and my income and everything seems great, does that make me more or less likely to go buy a new car? More likely to do that. And the self-fulfilling prophecy of it is this: if I feel good about it, maybe so does everybody else. And so a lot of other people feel the same way. And we all go out and buy new cars. And so as a result, the market for new cars, the demand shifts to the right as people demand more new cars because everyone's feeling pretty good about things. But if I feel lousy about things, my job is in danger, my income is in peril, maybe I don't feel good about the future, maybe I want to stay away. I was going to buy a new car, but now I'm not. So I'm going to simply keep driving the old Joker that I've got, and I'm going to replace the muffler, replace the transmission, and all these other things, because I just really don't know. And by the way, if I'm thinking that, maybe a lot of other people are also thinking that. So demand for autos, new cars shifts to the left. But in both cases, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We think things are going to be good, so things become better. We create more output and income. If we think things are going to be bad, we go this direction. We demand and create less output and income. And this is why policymakers, particularly elected officials, will do their best, especially US presidents, to say things are okay, don't freak out, everybody, continue on, things are going to be fine, we'll all make it through this, whatever this is. And I know that in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, President Bush was criticized, but I understood what he was doing. He was telling people to go ahead and fly again, it's fine, go to Disney World, take a vacation. And of course, those who can't resist taking a shot at people say, oh, well, we just had a terrorist attack and he wants us to go to Disney World. Well, what he's really getting at is he didn't want the economy to sink into recession. By the way, it was already sort of entering that anyway at the time those attacks happened. But it's sort of accepted that presidents will always talk up the economy, sort of jawbone, in order to get people to do things and to make people feel good about things. And so as a result, that self-fulfilling prophecy will come about. So and I don't think you necessarily had Disney World as Disney World per se, but rather go back and fly again. It's okay. It's relatively safe. And the idea is that, by the way, everybody who flew on 9/11 was safer than everybody who drove on 9/11, even though a bunch of people got killed on 9/11 in planes. More people got killed in cars on 9/11 than did people who flew. So that's a little bit of creepy food for thought along those lines, if you kind of get the idea. But it's the self-fulfilling prophecy of expectations that sort of cause that to be what it is. Okay? All right, so that does it for demand. Are there questions for me about anything with regard to the demand function? I'm going to try to look over here to see if anybody has any comments, and I don't see anything new in the chat box, and hopefully we won't have to go through this exercise too much longer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and erase this, and hopefully everyone's got this. And so let's move on to supply. Talk about what supply is. So in your slide package, you'll see supply. What is the definition of supply? Supply is once again the ability and willingness. Those two terms, ability and willingness to supply output at a given price and quantity. When we think of supply, we tend to think of business firms. And that would be the market for outputs. A business firm is the market for outputs, or provides the market for outputs on the supply side. But it could also be labor in those households as a supplier of labor. That would be supplying input. So again, we have this idea of roles that are played by actors that both give you on the demand and supply side at different times, but are the same people. Okay. So the ability and willingness of potential sellers to provide goods for sale at various prices and quantity, ability and willingness. Okay, and then this leads us to the law of supply. And by the way, in economics, we have very few laws, unlike chemistry and physics, where there are lots of laws, you know, with relation to things like gravity and electromagnetism and, you know, things like that, air pressure and whatnot. We don't have very many in econ. We really only have two, law of demand and law of supply. And when it comes to the law of demand, there are a few goods, by the way, which violate the law of demand, where we think of the downward, the demand curve being downward sloping, where demand will be actually be upward sloping for some very small, very, very small subset of goods in the on the demand side that react just opposite of the demand curve. We call them Giffen goods, named for the economist who first discovered them. So there is that, given the fact that we only got really two laws and one can be violated. The second one, though, really can't be violated because it doesn't make sense that it would be. It doesn't make much sense that the law of demand could ever be violated, but it does, given the sort of oddball nature that some on the demand side find themselves in. In supply, though, it tends to be a little bit more rational. Basically, it's the direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supply. So it's the direct relationship between price and quantity supply. Okay, and then the law of supply basically looks like this. If the price of a good is going up, the quantity supply will also go up. If the price of a good is going down, the quantity supply will also go down. And so that is the sort of, excuse me, sort of the enshrinement of what the supply curve, what the supply function looks like. Again, it is a functional relationship between price and quantity. It's a functional relationship between price and quantity. And so when we talk about this, what does it look like when we come up with a functional relationship? Well, we've got something like this. On the PQ plane, a supply curve would be, if you've got a direct relationship, as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up, then supply is upward sloping. And so it basically looks something like this. That if you start with some point, just a random point that we pick on the supply curve, we'll call it P1, Q1. And if the price were to change for some reason, whatever reason, doesn't matter, maybe something going on the other side of the market with demand, in other words, then the price goes up and so does the quantity supplied. And so as a result, what can we say about this? They go in the same direction, not the opposite case as in the case of demand. But demand was downward sloping, this is upward sloping. So again, a movement along the supply curve is due to changes in price only. So movement along the S curve is due only to price changes. Okay, and only price changes. And what's happening is there's simply a change. The price of the good has changed, and so now as a result, suppliers will provide more output. This is not particularly difficult to follow. I think most of us can grasp this idea. If I'm a seller of goods, I want high prices. If the price of the goods that are rising in the market are in fact rising, then I'm going to supply more output to capture that. I'm going to go after that. Why wouldn't I? I'd be crazy not to. And if the price falls for whatever reason, we reverse the condition where we start with P2, Q2, now we go back the other direction. Excuse me, if the price of the good falls, I'll supply less
we were
output
chasing.
for this particular good because maybe I'll supply more of some other good. I'll utilize my resources differently. This is, by the way, sort of a manifestation of this production possibilities model. If the price is going down, maybe I do less of this good, whatever this good in question is, and I do more of something else simply because of the fact that it's a price issue. So that could be one of the drivers for why we would prefer to do more of one good or less of one good in terms of quantity. Okay. So movements along the supply curve are due to changes in price and only due to changes in price. Now, supply goes a little bit faster because we don't have to necessarily go through all the methodology that we did before with regard to the demand function, but we'll go through just basically what this is when it comes to shifts. So if we have a PQ, couple PQ graphs here, oops, let me do this again. A couple of PQ graphs. And we've got some initial supply curves, start as 0, and S0, then what happens if we, as economists, are noting that the supply curve is shifting? That is, S0 has gone to some S1. Well, what does that mean? Well, again, let's think about this. A supply curve, in this case, it might be a straight line. We have sort of drawn into straight lines. It sort of helps the math along. A function example of that might look something like this, where price equals 1.25Q plus 10, right? In other words, it's a positively sloped function, right, at S0. And so now if S0 goes to S1, well, what's going on here? Now this is an increase in overall supply. So at the same price, right? At the same price, more quantity is supplied at every price. So a rightward shift is an increase in overall supply, and that is more QS at every price. So it's not the price of the good that's changing here, it's something else. The price change might simply cause a movement along the supply curve, but a shift when the entire function is changing means something is going on. So maybe now S1 goes P equals 1.25Q plus 4. So it's got a lower intercept point, and this is why you want to think right, left, not up, down, because a rightward shift looks like it's coming down. So if you think of this might look like it's a decrease in supply. It's actually an increase in supply, but it's going this direction. So just given the slope of it, though, you want to be careful. That's why we say think right, left, not up, down. So the supply, so again, the same slope, and it's still positively sloped. It's just more QS at every P. So it's a rightward shift. A rightward shift is an increase in overall supply. That is, more quantity is supplied at every price. And if in fact we would go to the opposite direction, well, now we have a leftward shift, and we'll call that S2. Then at the same price, then we have less quantity supplied at every price. Less quantity supplied at every price. And so here we put Q sub S to differentiate quantity supplied from quantity demanded. So S2 might have something like this, might have a different intercept point. So same slope plus say 14. Okay, oh, that's Q. Left out the Q there. Okay. Again, these are only just for purposes of explanation and illustration. You're not going to have to work with actual demand functions and supply functions. And again, sometimes you'll see Q in terms of P in terms of Q. It doesn't make any difference. It's just however you want to isolate, whatever variable you want to isolate for whatever it is you're trying to do, if you are doing that. And I'll bring that up just in case you do come across some examples of demand or supply functions elsewhere. So and in fact, I think maybe the appendix to chapter 3 might have some examples of demand and supply functions. I can't recall exactly. And I don't know that I've seen the appendix to this new edition, this 22nd edition, but it might very well be that there are some equations on there. Don't really worry about them so much. All I'm really trying to do is to illustrate the point that the equation is changing. Because the equation is changing, it's no longer a snapshot where we go click. This is where supply is today, right now. This is more of a motion picture where things are shifting. And so here you've got a rightward shift, and here you've got a leftward shift. Again, left, right, not up, down, because here, this is a decrease, but it looks like it's going up. It's actually going to the left. It's a decrease, less quantity supplied at every price. And so let's talk about what can cause shifts to the supply curve. And it's, once again, it's not due to the price of the good, of this good itself. Whatever this good in question is, it's not due to the price, it's due to non-price variables that we call the determinants of supply, which are in effect sort of the DNA of supply. It's the chemical formula, the secret sauce that makes up whatever it is that makes up supply for this good at any particular time. And that will change over time. And the number one variable here, and this is one you probably should circle, highlight, put a star by, because it's the number one by far, and it's changes in the cost of production. Overwhelmingly, changes in the cost of production are responsible for shifts in supply. And it basically goes something like this. If you've got a rightward shift going on, then it means if the cost of production is going down, you're almost always going to have a rightward shift in supply. Because why? If it costs you less to do something, then you're going to do more of that at every price level. So what could cause a change in the price of something? Well, let's say you're a trucking company and one of your big inputs is fuel. And let's say fuel costs are falling. Well, that means you can operate more trucks, more hours per day, hire more workers, and supply more output if in fact the price of fuel is falling. Now we know at the moment it's not falling, but you get the idea. And it doesn't matter what the input is. Maybe it's some price of labor is falling, right? Price of labor is falling for various reasons. Maybe the workforce has agreed to take a pay cut, whatever. You'll supply more output as a result of that particular reality. And then if cost of production is going up, it'll be the opposite condition. If it costs you more to do whatever it is you're doing, you'll supply less output. So if the price of fuel is rising, we'll supply less output. Excuse me, for a trucking company or airline or whatever, simply because of that relationship. Excuse me, I'm just trying to get over this cough here, and I think it's more allergies than it is. I don't feel sick at all. I think it's just seasonal allergies that you kind of hit me a little bit earlier. So anyway, bear with me. I apologize for that. So, so what we're talking about here are simply changes in the cost of production that really influence what's going on. And when I say put a star by it, circle it, highlight it, it's because this is really far and away the most important aspect of supply. Because we're going to make the case in this class that really the supply side tends to be fairly logical. And the reason that I can't think of a good that violates the law of supply is because the fact that it doesn't make sense that a good would obey that any supplier would disobey the law of supply. I don't know why you would provide more output of a good if the price goes down and less if the price goes up, because it just sort of defies logic. And if the cost of production is falling, why you wouldn't shift to produce more output at every price. And if the cost of production is rising, you produce less output at every price. It just seems to sort of make sense. And suppliers, even though they might make mistakes in the very short run, tend to be long run logical usually. In fact, a lot of economists are of the opinion that all economic actors are long run rational. They might make decisions in the short run that are mistakes and are stupid, and they realize they've goofed. But in the long run, they learn from their mistakes, they make better decisions, and business firms have time to sort of adjust and figure out. And by the way, a lot's on the line for them as well, so they can't afford to make some of the mistakes that we as consumers might periodically make from time to time. So number one is the cost of production. That's a biggie. Also, changes in technology and innovation is number two. Now, here's the good news about this one, and that is it's almost always responsible for a rightward shift. That is, it's usually because when is technology adopted in the first place, it tends to make us able to do things better, cheaper, and faster. In other words, for the same output level, we could do it cheaper. And so as a result, supply functions tend to shift right. And the evidence of this is absolutely overwhelming, going all the way back 200 years to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where the adoption of technology allowed producers to produce more and more and more output. And I know that there's often been this sort of perceived conflict between labor and machine goods where, you know, labor is replaced by machines. And the answer is yes, in the short run, labor often does get replaced by machines, but labor finds its way into doing something else while the machines produce more and more output and are able to do it by bringing the price down. As we go in this direction, keep in mind, we're also moving downward on this price axis. And so this is why we have lots of availability of goods at very low prices, because you can make a lot of the goods that we consume on a daily basis if you wanted to. I mean, I guess if you wanted to, you could make your own soap, and you could make your own butter, and you could, you know, make your own bread from scratch. And I know people do those things, but they might do them because they're fun to do, they're a hobby, they're something interesting, and there's something to keep yourself busy. You can plant your garden, grow your own vegetables. Yes, people do that, but the reality is most people do not do those things because we have a mass market that can deliver those for very, very low prices because just the tremendous amount of volume of output that we can create. I have no idea what it would cost to make a bar of soap in my backyard. I had a professor acquaintance of mine over at UNM who actually made her own soap in the backyard. It was like an all afternoon affair. And, you know, you can go to Albertsons and buy a bar of soap for what, $1, I don't know, but not very much. Certainly not an afternoon's worth of work, I don't think. But you get the idea. But she did it because it was fun and something to do and whatever. But you get the idea that because we've got this ability to produce more and more output, it's a rightward shift. Now, here's the thing about it, though. It's not as though businesses are always necessarily accepting of this, because sometimes they're brought kicking and screaming into this rightward shift because it's sort of forced on them by competition. So if you think about, let's say in a store, I'll go back to one of these examples of A and B, only two examples. You've got two grocery stores, and you're back in the day when cashiers used to type in the price of every individual good. It used to take forever to check out. And today you can scan. You can scan yourself out and be in and out quickly. Well, if one store adopts that optical scanning technology and the other is plodding along, you know, and keeping people in line or whatever, then they're going to lose business. And so they're going to have to adopt the new technology because they simply have to as a competitive nature. Maybe they don't want to, maybe they don't like technology. There are suppliers who don't like technology. That's unfortunate for them. It really, really is. And in fact, almost anybody in the commercial world who is not accepting of technology really had better get their head on straight, because it's all changing. And I mean, I am of the age in which first generation computer user, right, in business. And even as maybe 20 years ago, when I was still in banking, you'd occasionally have a person who'd been around a while who didn't use email. Don't send me an email. I never check my email. Today, that you just can't have it. You can't have somebody who doesn't check email. It's like somebody who doesn't check their regular mail, because that is regular mail, right? So you get the idea. You've got to adapt, but in so doing, it makes it more efficient. And as a result, everyone's better off by the adoption of technology. So it's almost always rightward, because it doesn't make sense that it could be leftward. Why would you adopt technology that is worse than what you had before? That doesn't make any sense. Number of sellers in a market. This is simply the same kind of rationale we talked about with regard to demand. Those sellers coming in, sellers leaving for whatever reason. Sellers rush into a market because it's the hot new thing, so they want to capture a piece of that. And as a result, they want to jump on the bandwagon to do that. If that market so suddenly no longer looks good or whatever, they will get out of that market because they don't want to be in it. Simply entry and exit of sellers into a market to the extent that they can do it. Sometimes it's not easy to get into a market. Sometimes it's not easy to get out of a market, but it's the very same idea that you can, in fact, come in and go out, and that's going to affect the supply function. Also, changes in taxes and regulation. Well, here, this is almost identical to the cost issue. If, in fact, taxes are going down, then the supply function will tend to shift to the right. And if taxes are going up, we'll call it T. Taxes are going up, supply will almost always shift to the left. And this is simply other than the fact that it's a recognition that taxes are a cost of doing business. And if taxes are going down, then it makes us more likely to produce more output level at every price. Why? Because it makes it cheaper to do it. It's just one less thing to worry about if taxes are lower. And in fact, as we get a little bit later in the course, we talk more about the theory piece. We'll talk about a particular sort of theory of economics called supply side economics, which was very popular in the 80s during President Reagan's first term. And that was the idea of lowering taxes on businesses so that businesses would invest more in equipment, technology, and spend more money, supply more goods. It would grow the economy. We'd move outward on this vector here, and that would be considered to be a good thing. So that's an example. Regulation, same way, same as with taxes. And then finally, business outlook and expectations. And that is this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think the economy is going to be good next year and my market's going to be good, I'm going to ramp up to supply more output. If I think it's very dicey, very uncertain, very negative perhaps, I'm going to supply less output at every price or be ready to do that simply because of the way I feel about it. And again, those self-fulfilling prophecies oftentimes do create the outcome that we expected to happen for good or ill. The only difference between expectations when it comes to the supply side versus that of demand, which we talked about earlier, is the idea we tend to we call these forecasts in the business world. And every business firm of any size has got to do some kind of forecast, even if they simply call it a budget. And that is, we have to have some idea of where we're going, some idea of what the future will look like, even if that future is just a year ahead of time. I mean, it's pretty hard for a company to say what things are going to look like in 20 years. I mean, it is. There are some companies with a very, very long time horizon. I'm thinking of Boeing as one example, where they can pretty much project what the demand for its aircraft is going to be 20 years out. But that's a very long chain of production, very expensive goods, and the buyers commit up front years ahead of time for these airlines around the world commit to Boeing of what they're going to buy. So they have a pretty good idea what it's going to be years ahead. But that's one of the few exceptions. Most firms, most sellers don't have that ability to do that, to project too much more beyond a year, 2 years, 5 years. It just becomes very difficult because all kinds of things can happen. And I can recall, I was still in banking. We'll go back to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. You know, I was in banking. We were talking about all these forecasts for the next year. This was September, so we were looking for the next year. And suddenly that next day, then we were at the planning meeting with the terrorist attacks. And suddenly everything had to be revised because the economy was going to be thought to go into a downturn. And so everything had to be revised as a result of that. Okay. All right. So questions about the supply curve, the supply function, shifts in supply, which are different than movements along the supply curve. Movements along the supply curve due only a change in price, shifts due to changes in non-price variables. One final bit here, and we'll wrap up chapter 3, and that has to do with putting them both together. And I know that we're covering chapter 3, or chapter 3 was the assigned reading for this week, so we're not really terribly behind. And chapter 6, we're certainly not going to get all the way through tonight if we do get into it at all, but we're really in pretty good shape. So if we put demand and supply together here, what does that look like? Then we have this kind of deal going on. We have an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. And so what we immediately see here is we've got this sort of X configuration, and that is the idea that they're two opposite sloped functions because the reaction to price is different. But we knew this. And I sort of framed this for the class a few minutes ago when I said this is sort of a battlefield, not literally, but figuratively a battlefield where demand and supply are sort of slugging it out. Sellers want high prices and they'll respond by providing more output as the price goes up. Buyers want low prices and they'll demand more output only as prices are lower. So there's a conflict that's inherent in a market. That's reflected in the differing slopes of these two curves. Sellers want high prices, buyers want low prices, but at some point they've got to have a compromise and meeting the minds. And so where demand and supply come together, we have a condition known as equilibrium. And equilibrium really is in two phases, right? It's a state of short-term balance. A state of short-term balance in a market. And the balance in a market is as to price and quantity. So just like these functions can shift and we need to take a picture, so is the case of equilibrium, because when we talk about equilibrium, we're talking about equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So what equilibrium is just this sort of natural settling in point where there is a natural meeting of the minds where yes, buyers want lower prices, but really can't have them. Sellers want higher prices, but maybe can't have exactly what they want, but they settle on a market price. And this market price, we're going to simply call P star. It's a P with an asterisk, and which we pronounce P star. Everywhere in economics where you see a little asterisk, you're talking almost always about some equilibrium condition. That's just sort of a shorthand for everything you see in economics, and I think probably in finance as well. Whenever you see a little asterisk, you're talking about some equilibrium condition. That is some short-term state. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. And let's talk about what these things are. We're saying it's a state of short-term balance where the market comes to rest. That is, the market is what it is, and prices are relatively stable at a given time. By the way, this is not that unusual of a concept. In fact, I think most of us know that the prices of most things are relatively stable. I know gasoline is one of those that's a little bit unpredictable, and healthcare, and there are goods that are volatile in terms of price, goods and services both. But for the most part, if we go to Walmart, and we want to buy, I don't know, hairspray, or we want to buy paper towels, we're not just completely gobsmacked usually about the price of those particular goods. It's going to be about what we expected. So in other words, we're selling out. In fact, it may be identical to what we paid 2 weeks ago or a month ago. It may be the exact same price for those of you who look at the prices of goods. They don't really change very much. So as a result, equilibrium price is not that foreign of a concept. It's not that theoretical at all. Most goods do settle in a short-term condition. It's short-term because it will change, because we know the prices of everything change over time. Mostly they go up as our economy inflates, and we'll talk much more about that general state of inflation. But for the most part, they'll stay that way in the short run. So when we talk about equilibrium price, it's fairly stable. Equilibrium quantity is also a condition of relative stability as well. And by the way, equilibrium quantity is the point at which quantity demanded just happens to equal quantity supplied. Quantity demanded just happens to equal quantity supplied. And so because of this, because P, that P star is associated with that Q star, we say that this P star is what's known as a market clearing price. In other words, it's the price that creates no surpluses or shortages. So it's a market clearing price, that there are no surpluses. And a surplus is the condition where the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, and there are no shortages, which are conditions where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. The fact that these are inequalities mean that those are out of equilibrium conditions. Surpluses and shortages are out of equilibrium conditions. And they would look something like this. If the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, right here, quantity supplied here, quantity demanded there, then we would have a surplus. And if there's a surplus of anything, right, there's too much of a good, the price will fall in order to clear that, right? There's too much of it, we're choking on this good, enough of this good, the price will have to fall in order to get rid of the good. And it's oftentimes the seller who will recognize it because goods are stacking up on shelves. It's not moving. Likewise, if quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, then what do we got here? We got a shortage. We have more demand for the good than there is quantity supplied for the good. And so as a result, there's not enough of it, and the price will go up as suppliers provide more of it. We certainly saw shortages happen during the early stages of the pandemic, where there were shortages of all these things like cleaning products and bleach and little wipey things, like Clorox wipey bleach things, whatever you call those. They were just flying off shelves. You couldn't find them. And there were stories about people just hoarding these, putting them on like eBay and selling them at great markups, simply because there was a shortage. More quantity demanded than there was quantity supplied. And the fact of the matter, to clear that, the prices got to go up. And there is probably going to be somebody who will pay the price for that, just like people were paying these ridiculous prices for bleach and for other kinds of things. And I don't know if anybody noticed that particular phenomenon. It was a very goofy sort of reaction on the part of the market. Maybe it was not as goofy as what it might seem to me, but it was a little bit illogical because people rushing to hoard goods, it actually created the shortage that we feared. If everybody had just sort of maintained their cool, there wouldn't have been a shortage of anything, but instead people were sort of freaking out a little bit. So we see this happening though, and I come from the upper Midwest, where every time there's a giant snowstorm coming, everybody goes to the store and wipes out bread and Coke and beer and all this other stuff off the shelves, thinking that they'll never have those goods ever again. They'll be snowed in for the rest of their lives or whatever. So human behavior is what it is. That's why we have this whole realm of behavioral psychology. So anyway, the market clearing price is, when we say clears the market, we're saying it's the price that corresponds to where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So there is no surplus and there is no shortage. And so the evidence for equilibrium tells us what? It tells us there's pretty good evidence that there is equilibrium, that it exists in real life. And how do we know that? Well, because most of the goods that we buy on a routine basis are about the same price that we expect to pay. Even something volatile like gasoline, well, it was $4.19 yesterday. I noticed today it's still 419. It was 319, what, 6 months ago or whatever. So it's short term, it's not going to stay the same. But even a market that's volatile will still have fairly stable prices, at least in the very short run. The longer run is a little bit of a different situation. So that's one bit of evidence for equilibrium existing, and not just existing as a theoretical concept. The other is the idea that when we go to stores, retailers, or even to wholesalers or manufacturing plants, we're not just falling all over goods, but they're not just spilling out everywhere. There's nowhere to store it. And likewise, there's no wipeout of goods, but there's the absolute shortage, generally speaking. Yes, we know we've had some shortages that are pandemic related, but it's out of equilibrium condition. A lot of markets have been out of equilibrium with regard to the pandemic, and that's what happens. But again, these out of equilibrium conditions are something that are non-price related, forced on it, and certainly I don't think a lot of people saw or forecast that coming. Okay, so that's what equilibrium is: state of short-term balance in a market as to price and quantity. Okay, questions for me about anything with regard to that? Okay, well, I've got one final bit here, which really relates to changes in equilibrium based upon shifts. So I'm going to go ahead, I think, and erase this here and talk about this idea of what we call market dynamics. And that is the idea that demand and supply can change and can cause all kinds of changes in equilibrium. So let's do this. Let's take changes in demand. And by the way, I know your textbook will get into simultaneous shifts in demand and will supply at the same time. And I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say, let's move one thing in the market at one time and then leave everything else alone. So let's take changes in demand first, see what happens to equilibrium. So let's just create a couple of graphs here. And without taking too much time on this, and let's take changes in supply, okay? So the first thing we want to do is model increases in both of these. And so let's just draw demand, and we'll say we've got some D1 and D1 here, and demands, and I'm kind of running out of green ink here, demands, all right. And we've got some, we're going to shift supply, so we're going to start with some S1 and S1, S and S, okay? All right, so let's take a look at what happens here with changes in supply, changes in demand. So if we are talking, first of all, about rightward shifts, increases, and we start out with some equilibrium condition, and because they're equilibrium conditions, we can put a little asterisk by it because they are, in fact, equilibrium conditions. So what happens when there's a rightward shift in supply? Again, we're only going to move one side of the market at a time. We're not going to try to do simultaneous shifts because it just makes it more complicated and doesn't really advance, I don't think, what we're trying to do. So what happens when this happens? There's a rise in demand for whatever reason, rising incomes, right? Positive expectations, good feelings about things. As a result, if there's a rise in demand, there's going to be greater quantity demand exchanged in the market, which is what the Q is. The quantity exchange, it's an equilibrium too, still an equilibrium condition. And what happens is the price tends to go up because if the supply function is not been able to change to react to it immediately, then the price is going to go up. So if everyone's demanding these particular goods for which the supply can't catch up in the very short run, the price is going to go up, even while sellers are scrambling and doing their best to try to accommodate that rise in demand. And the change in quantity will be the change in quantity supply. And so as a result, the suppliers will slide up along their supply curve to take advantage of that higher price. The higher price that's caused by what? Caused by a change in demand, change in overall demand, a rightward shift to the right, away from the origin, an increase at every price level. But in so doing, because supply is not caught up, the price is actually going to go up along with the quantity itself. Okay? What about a shift in the other direction where we've got some initial condition, some P1, Q1, and now the supply curve is going to the, or I'm sorry, the demand curve is going to the left. And so now we've got D1 moving to D2. We have a new equilibrium condition. It means there are fewer buyers in the market or buyers are staying away. There's a reduction in demand for whatever reason, maybe incomes are falling, So these are bad economic times, whatever. And as a result, the goods that are there are going to go for lower prices because people are running away from this good, whatever this good in question is. Maybe there's a substitute that's got a lower price, and so people are buying the substitute and less of this good. If demand keeps falling, it might actually hit the vertical axis and go to zero, and so there is no more demand for the good. And that does sometimes happen. Sometimes demand for a good continues to fall to the point where there is really essentially no demand for the good at all. And whatever supply is left is simply leftover inventory. It's no longer, nothing new is being produced, and it ends up somewhere at Big Lots or something. Goes around the world a couple times and ends up there. Okay, so those are shifts in demand. And again, I know I keep saying this, but I know your textbook will model like simultaneous shifts in demand and supply. If you want to do that, you can. I mean, you can say, okay, well, demand shifts to the right, then what happens if supply also shifts right? Well, you can do that for yourself. You can sort of model it and see what happens. You won't be faced with it on an exam. I'll just tell you that right now. Okay. All right. What about a change in supply? Well, again, we're talking here about a rightward shift. So let's say you've got an increase from S1 to S2, which means that there's a increase in supply. And so as a result, what happens? Maybe it's new suppliers coming into the market. As a result, more quantity is going to be exchanged. And so Q is going to go up. And if maybe new suppliers are coming in, the price is going to go down for whatever reason. Maybe it's even the cost of production is falling. Remember, that was the number one driver of demand of supply shifts is cost of production. So maybe the cost of production is falling for whatever reason. Maybe taxes are falling even. As a result, firms are going to supply more output, and they can do it at a lesser price because there's a lesser cost of doing business. And again, we want to differentiate and distinguish between cost and price. Cost is an internal matter to sellers, where price is external to sellers and involves both sellers and buyers. Okay. And then the final scenario is simply a leftward shift in supply, where S1 now goes to S2. There's a leftward shift, and so what started out as a P1 Q1 equilibrium condition now results in less quantity exchanged because there's less supply. And if there are fewer suppliers, then, and demand is unchanged, we're saying demand is unchanged still. Oops. Demand is unchanged. And so as a result, the price will go up as a result of this. So what's happening is here, there was a rightward shift, and here there's a leftward shift. And as a result, there's a decrease in supply. Maybe it's once again due to a rise in the cost of doing business. And some sellers say, I can't take it. I don't want to incur these higher costs. I'm out, I'm going to go away, I'm not coming back, and I'm done. And so as a result, they leave the market. And they may leave, but they may be permanently gone, right? Or they may come back. It all really depends. But these are the ideas. So this is something to get familiar with. And because if you're on an exam or quiz and you're faced with a question, all right, we're shifting demand, but no shift in supply will result in what in terms of equilibrium? And you want to sort of draw these out, didn't do so. I mean, this is what professional economists do all the time, is simply draw these out by hand. It's not a problem. People do it all the time. And by the way, if you're ever wondering, is demand upward sloping or downward sloping? Because this is something that comes up where you can't really recall. The one mnemonic device is D is downward, demand downward. That's one way to look at it. Or supply is upward sloping, supply to the sky is sort of the mnemonic device. They're kind of goofy, but there are mnemonic devices. If they work for you, whatever works. I'm all in favor of mnemonic devices. I think they're great. I think they help describe what's going on. Okay. And I know that the rest of chapter 3 deals with a lot of other some other issues, not only just the simultaneous shifts issues, but I think we'll then lead on to a discussion coming up, which is why we're going to skip the next couple of chapters, because they deal with things that are more micro in nature, things like price controls, and, excuse me, and taxation of individual goods. We're not going to be covering those here because we really, it's more of a micro topic in reality. So we're going to sort of skip over that, and we're going to go on to chapter 6. And so this is pretty much all that I had to talk about with regard to chapter 3. And I'm going to go ahead and I guess I can leave this up here if you like. This is reproduced elsewhere in your book, so The only reason I'm doing it here in real time is to sort of show the process as we sort of work through it. That the idea of one thing leading to another. So these first three chapters that we've covered now, 1, 2, and 3, and the chapter 1 appendix, are really sort of the foundational content. In fact, if you look at almost any econ textbook, really it seems like the first 3 chapters, culminating with chapter 3 dealing with demand, supply, and equilibrium, are almost all identical. They all cover more or less the same topics, and they all cover essentially the same ground, sort of laying the groundwork for what is to come. And so from here, it's going to be all macro all the time, because these individual models here are really micro models where I talked about examples like the market for shoes or the market for whatever. It doesn't really make any difference. But the methodology is the same, and it's going to be important because it's going to come up again, particularly as we build macro models. And so let's just sort of do a brief lead, and we'll only get about 5 minutes, 4 minutes, and let's just give a little brief introduction into to chapter 6. There's a lot going on in chapter 6. It's a good chapter. There's no way I'm going to get through it tonight. I didn't have any expectation that I would, but we will talk more about it next time. I want to talk about this idea of business cycles. So if we were to draw a time series graph where we have time on this axis here, and we have total output of goods and services on this axis here, okay? That is the total dollar value of all output being produced, which we will come to define later as GDP, which right now we don't need to know that, but we'll get to that a bit later in this particular chapter. So what do we got? Let's say we can mark off certain points in history, 1850, 1900, 1950, 2000, whatever, right? And we can mark off different points. And it would be very nice if economic growth looked something like this, where it just simply goes up and up and up and up and up in a more or less straight line as a linear function that's constantly sloped. We knew exactly what to expect. We knew what the future was going to hold because the future was going to have the same growth rate. Next year was the same growth rate as this year's growth rate, which was the same as last year's growth rate. In other words, the growth in output and income is going up over time. Unfortunately, we know that that is not the case. Instead, what we've got is something like this, where we've got ups and downs of the business cycle. That is, we've got rises and falls, and that is simply the reality. This may not be drawn exactly to scale. That is, it might not be, well, I guess maybe there was a downturn here in 1930s, boom from 1950. Maybe it's not that unrealistic, but all I'm simply trying to do is to point out the direction of some of these changes here, whether they accidentally fall along the individual lines of this axis is irrelevant. We know that we have these oscillations, we call them business cycles, and they're really stages of the business cycles. That is this: when output and income are growing, we simply call it an expansion. And when output and income are falling, we refer to that as a recession. These are terms that are probably familiar to both of us, to all of us. And that is particularly the idea of a recession. Only economists have a very specific definition of a recession, and that's a decline in output for 2 consecutive quarters. That is 2 3-month periods in a row. That constitutes a recession. That's a downturn, okay? And then we know when the recession's over because we hit some bottom that we simply call a trough. And we know when an expansion is ending because we call that a peak. And right now, there's a lot of evidence that we may be at a peak in the business cycle because of the fact that policy is about to change. Interest rates are going to go up. We're seeing a lot of inflationary conditions because we do have pretty strong, robust growth, and it may be too much for our own good. And the Federal Reserve in the next day or two is going to tell us what their decision is going to be on that. Is it a peak of the business cycle? I don't know, but it sort of feels like one to me. But these are the examples of this particular thing going on. Particularly recessions, we're going to talk a lot about that. And we're also going to talk about these upswings in the business cycles. In other words, it'd be nice if we had a simple growth rate around a trend line, and the trend line was the growth rate, but it's not. Instead, we have these oscillations, and we simply refer to them as business cycles. And why do we have them? Why on earth are they necessary? Why do we have to have them? Well, a lot of it is due to simply the idea that there's instability in some of the elements of demand throughout the economy. And that is particularly when it comes to business spending. Businesses are very volatile when it comes to spending, depends upon their outlook and forecasts. Also, it could be supply issues, something like a pandemic that nobody saw coming, or war, or famine, or something like that. So they can be caused by supply disruptions, demand disruptions, whatever. Nonetheless, there are these oscillations in the business cycle, and the goal of policymakers is to sort of smooth them out. And by the way, what has happened is through what's called stabilization policy, which has really got two elements, and I'm out of time now. But the idea is to try to take down these wild oscillations and sort of bring down the static so we have a closer to trend growth without the boom bust cycle that was indicative really of the early years of American history. The first 100 years or so, it was boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. That is wild boom times followed by depressed bad times, boom, bust. And we want to sort of take that away and have little boomlets and bustlets, that is a little smaller rises, a little smaller drops, so we can, it makes our lives a little bit easier from that regard, okay? All right, so I am out of time. Are there questions for me that you want to type into the chat box? I'm sorry I can't hear you. I really am sorry. This is not the way I like to teach. I like to be able to hear people and see them when you want to be seen. I mean, you can turn your camera on or off. I know some instructors get very dictatorial about that. I do not, but hopefully, cross my fingers and toes, we'll have this resolved next time. So in the meantime, if you have questions about anything that's going on, get with me and let me know. If you have any issues with the quiz, questions, give me a call, send me an email, whichever you prefer, and I'm more than glad to try to work with the individual and solve whatever kind of question you've got. So, okay. All right, everybody have a great week, and I will see you next time.